And Arizona's become more of a moderate state. It's not as conservative as it was in the early stages with people like Barry Goldwater representing them and even John McCain. So I think you see Arizona coming of age.
Rick, thanks so much. Bloomberg contributor Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital. Thank you very much for your thoughts so far. We are just 5 seconds away from the start of the European equity market session. So let's get to thinking about where we're going to open up here, or open down, more importantly, because futures certainly were moving to the downside, down 1.8% on Euro Stoxx 50 futures. FTSE futures were negative. The FTSE is opening down, not as much as we expected to settle at. It's down just 0.2%, but futures have certainly been suggesting some.
Morning, everybody. I'm placing a stop on profit for Swiss franc at 0.91387. As you can see from yesterday, late evening, we purchased Swissy. So today I'm placing an order to sell, and I will move the stop on profit higher to 0.91487. Okay. Okay, it's done.
Not just days, but weeks. If this goes to legal challenge, we are all thinking about what happened in 2000, and that was only one state. This could be legal challenge in a number of other states. So this is very much on the market's mind as we see the dollar, as a result, gaining ground, and pretty much all other currencies, not all, but many of them, selling off as a result.
Precisely, and beyond that, it also has immediate short-term effects in terms of the fiscal stimulus talks that are coming out of Washington, D.C., and the size of what we're going to see from that fiscal stimulus. And likewise, to your point, not just at the presidential level, we're still awaiting some key Senate races as well. Maine, for example, North Carolina, another one on my list of notable Senate races to watch, which could really dramatically impact how the president, whomever that might be, is able to govern for their 4 years in office, Anna.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those who have maybe been lucky enough to get a bit of sleep overnight, let's just get up to date on the presidential race, because we've heard from President Trump and Joe Biden in the last 2 hours.
We believe we're on track to win this election. And we're feeling real good about Wisconsin and Michigan. And by the way, it's going to take time to count the votes. We're going to win Pennsylvania.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election. So our goal now is to ensure the integrity for the good of this nation. So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list.
So that's where things stand right now, and we're still waiting for states that have yet to be called yet: Alaska, Georgia, Maine at large, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and of course Wisconsin. As for where the electoral map stands with that state of Arizona and those 11 electoral college votes now, Joe Biden inching closer to 270, the threshold number. He has 235 compared to President Trump's 213. Still, again, we have to urge patience and caution because several of these states have not been called, most notably North Carolina and Pennsylvania. And now let's get the latest from both Trump and Biden headquarters, where our colleagues are standing by. Bloomberg's Mario Parker is at the White House, and Emily Wilkins is in Wilmington, Delaware. Emily, have you heard anything from the Biden campaign in response to what President Trump said within the last hour and a half?
No, I think the way that Biden did it, he responded to Trump before Trump said what he said. Biden has been anticipating that Trump might come out tonight, try and declare a victory, try and say that the election is the fraud. And so for days, Biden has been going out with the message, urging patience, urging to wait until all the ballots are counted. It's the message that he delivered tonight about an hour before Trump spoke. It's a message that I'm sure Senator Harris will touch on tomorrow when she addresses voters, and probably one that we'll hear from the Biden campaign throughout the next several days as we wait for vote totals to come in from Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin.
Emily, do we know where Senator Harris is going to be making her remarks tomorrow?
You know what? I'll be honest, I don't have those details yet.
It's
It's
okay.
been a whirlwind of a night. A lot of people went in not knowing what to expect, but we will be there to cover them when she does.
And the reason I bring it up is because will these campaigns start going to battleground states? I mean, Mario, I've spoken to sources on the president's reelection campaign who have told me in the past couple of days that they fully anticipate for the president to be traveling out of Washington, D.C. and maybe going to some of these battleground states to rally support. Is that what you're hearing from your sources?
Yes, absolutely, Kevin. One of the things that the president's campaign has been saying for a while now, at least for the last 2 weeks or so, is that they're going to run through the tape. They're going to run through into the finish line until something is decided here. And so it's no surprise that the president will continue to be out there. His campaign has been fundraising with an eye toward this very fight, asking donors to continue to chip in until mid-December even. And so, no, it's not a surprise at all that they're looking at continuing to essentially campaign.
Have they briefed reporters yet in terms of what specifically their legal strategy is going to be? Is it going to be Pennsylvania, or is there another state that they feel that they have a legal challenge? Have they offered any clues specifically on the legal route that they're going to take?
Sure, they haven't given us a briefing just yet, but there are plenty of clues. I mean, the president for weeks now has been talking about Pennsylvania. He's been talking about his displeasure with the Supreme Court decision over the weekend. He said that the Supreme Court still may have an opportunity to change its mind regarding Pennsylvania. We know that the campaign has talked a lot about Wisconsin and also Nevada as well. And we know that the arguments have stemmed around the counting of ballots beyond November 3rd.
Precisely. And now I think in the next 6 hours, I think you can bet that both of those campaigns are going to be huddled in their headquarters trying to figure out where the candidates will speak and where they will go and which states that this is ultimately going to come down to from a legal perspective. This is President Trump vowing to take this all the way to the Supreme Court if need be. Our thanks to Bloomberg's Mario Parker at the White House and Emily Wilkins in Wilmington, Delaware. Anna.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's check how all of that is going down with markets then, Kevin. We're 7 minutes into the European trading session, and European equity markets are nervous about a protracted battle here. So we see stocks 600 down 1.3%.
also essentially disenfranchised Republicans who felt they couldn't vote for Trump on various policy grounds.
All right, just some breaking news, headlines crossing the Bloomberg terminal. Joe Biden has won 3 of the 4 delegates in Maine, according to the Associated Press. And our thanks to Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow in Arizona. And Ed, Rick Davis tells me that you got to go get some tacos from TP in Phoenix. That's where the famous tacos are, Anna, according to Bloomberg Politics contributor Rick Davis.
Excellent. Well, we'll come to you for all the best taco advice, I'm sure. I'm sure there are a few people need a good taco after waiting up all night for the results here. And still, we don't have them, of course. Let's get to Sarah Hewen, Standard Chartered Head of Research, who can help us give a market perspective to what's going on here. Sarah, really good to speak to you. We've got European equity markets, risk assets falling out of bed, essentially, but not maybe as much as they were because of the uncertainty that is now introduced into this process. What is the time horizon that you're now looking at for this to get a conclusive decision here?
Well, we're really looking at the next 36 hours, I think, for the Pennsylvania count to come through. I guess later today we'll get Wisconsin, Michigan. That might be conclusive, but it may well be that we're still waiting for the final results by the end of the week. And then, of course, what markets are concerned about is that this result may well be contested. And I think that some of the comments that we had earlier from the president suggested that he's teeing up his supporters to potentially contest the votes as they emerge from those final 3 states. Risk-off trades have taken over from the blue wave trade that was in place up until late last night in UK time. So it's all about the uncertainty and how long this uncertainty will linger on.
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be much that we can be certain about, Sarah, overnight, but perhaps blue wave is something that we can have some certainty around, the fact that we're not going to see perhaps as much control going to the Democrats as had been anticipated, certainly in the market risk, the market pricing that we've seen over recent days. What is the biggest significance of that? Is it around fiscal stimulus in the US? What's your expectation there now?
I think it's very significant, but we perhaps have to differentiate between the very near term and the longer term. Very near term, it's clear that coronavirus cases are rising in the US. The concern is that you get a Europe type situation, and Congress has shown no willingness to come up with another stimulus plan. So that's the growing worry, is that the strong data that we've seen coming out of the US up until recently will start to fade, and that the economy will turn down again with no agreement from Congress for a stimulus. The Senate, Congress staying mixed, I think, is very significant. It reduces, if it is Biden's presidency, it reduces his ability to enact some tax measures. Obviously, he will be able to do a certain amount through executive orders, but the tax situation, I think, becomes much less leaning democratic. Foreign policy, that's still very much up in the air, whether we get a Trump or a Biden presidency. The focus is going to be very much, made in America, buy American, America first. So I think that some of the hopes that many of America's, many US allies, traditional allies, had for a sort of smoother and more open trade, that may not be forthcoming.
Sarah, it seems difficult to talk about anything that isn't connected with the US election today, so I won't try. But because this is very linked to it, and this is the fight against COVID-19 in the United States. Whoever wins, that fight will continue through the winter. What is your expectation as to how this spreads through the winter, and crucially, what damage this does then to the US economy, away from the human tragedy, of course, which is more important? But what is your assessment of the US economy through the winter?
Well, I mean, sitting in Europe, maybe we are too pessimistic here, but we've seen lockdowns being introduced across major European economies, in the UK as well, and we already see that impact on economic activity, particularly in the services sector. Now, the latest US data have stayed very strong, both manufacturing and services holding up well, consumer confidence picking up, consumer spending doing very well. And the concern is that as you inevitably see these coronavirus cases rising, hospitalizations rising, that states start to reintroduce restrictions, and that has a damaging impact on the economy. So it could well be that the fourth quarter is flat, or potentially if we see a deterioration this month and next month, we could be looking at a negative fourth quarter. And going into 2021, that's also a concern until we get a strong rollout of a vaccine, a successful vaccine. Then we are potentially facing this sort of stop and start type action, which limit how far the economy can grow.
Let me ask you, we're just getting the VIX index opening up, so just wanted to bring that to everybody. 36.82, so a move of 1.27, so a little bit higher on the VIX, a bit of nervousness, but we're waiting, aren't we, essentially waiting for results from Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Georgia, as we've been saying. Running into the election, Sarah, there had been a narrative in markets that a Biden presidency would be kinder to China in some way, although many people said that wasn't going to be the case, but then the yuan was acting as if it was going to be the case. What is your expectation of the US-China relationship going forward, depending on who wins?
I think whoever wins, that relationship is not going to be reset to where it was back in 2014, 2015, 2016. The approach from a Biden presidency may be more predictable, and we would expect that under Biden there would be a sort of getting everybody together, getting traditional allies together to address some of the concerns over China. But ultimately, tensions over technology are not going away, whoever is in the White House. And I think also that there are potential tensions even with a Biden White House.
Trump said, and President Trump then said what he was going to say. He's going to want to stop the vote counting, which is ridiculous. Just to be clear on that, in Alaska, the polls just closed a few hours ago, and we had over 100,000 absentee ballots that won't even be started to be counted until tomorrow. So I hope he's not planning to disenfranchise Alaskans. But here's where I focus. When I look at the states that are left, there's Pennsylvania, North Carolina, oddly enough, and Georgia, and then Michigan. I think Michigan, at the end of the day, if it comes, as I think it will, for Joe Biden, he's at 270, because the main announcement you just made, 3 out of the 4 delegates there, or electoral votes, go to Joe Biden, and Nebraska has this same situation. There's 1 there that goes. So there's 4 votes sitting there. And the way I calculate it, because he's going to win Nevada, he's winning Arizona, he's going to win Minnesota, he's going to win Wisconsin, because you just look at where those votes are left to come from. That gives you 254 votes. You need 16 to win at that point. So out of the 4 kind of toss-ups, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, if he wins Michigan, I think the president is planning on Pennsylvania as the battleground. Well, they may not need it. And Georgia, I actually think Georgia, I picked this last year as the wild card, and if Georgia comes in, where there's a lot of votes left in some strong Democratic areas, the race will be over. It'd be 270. That's it.
And just taking a pause from the presidential election for a minute, this is the S&P 500 index futures erased losses and turned flat. A lot of questions from the investor community about what this means for fiscal stimulus. And fiscal stimulus in particular, with all of this volatility coming with the elections, when that fiscal stimulus is going to happen. So when do you think, and how much do you think fiscal stimulus will be coming?
Well, they're going to have to do something, because I guarantee that as we move into, as you think about the retail sector, which is, very dependent on November and December, they're not going to have as great a retail sector if there's uncertainty in the economy, because the politics of this country are at loggerheads. And I think people are honestly fed up with it. They want to see resolution. I think the investment community, as you're seeing right now, just in some of the market activity, they want some stability so they can move on and figure out what to do and invest and work on the issue of the coronavirus to get that under control. So I think there's going to be an effort of some level in the lame duck, because there'll be some folks in the Senate and House that recognize they have to do something in order to keep this economy moving, and they have to put some more money into the economy. Come January, who's ever the president, I think there's going to be some aggressive spending. I think if it's Joe Biden, there's been a long talk that he's been interested in a massive infrastructure, invest in the economy, invest in the infrastructure of this country. In the Trump administration, I think it's going to be kind of coronavirus and, CARES Act 4 or 5. But they're going to have to do something, because the economy is, as you know, may the market be strong at times and up and down. The overall economy is still very fragile, lots of people out of work. And we're going into a holiday retail season that is very important for a lot of small retailers as well as big retailers. And if they don't see an economy move in the right direction, they're going to start doing some things that are going to be bad for the economy overall, by more layoff of more people and closing of more stores and consolidation.
And I would just add into that, another point of data reference for U.S. policymakers is going to be the coronavirus and the number of cases. You look at what's happening Germany, the UK, France, politically diverse countries that I just spoke of, and what they're having to deal with as a result of coronavirus spikes. And here in the United States, there hasn't been a reconciliation of sorts of the data increase on COVID-19. Let me ask you one more question about energy markets. I know energy policy is so crucial to a state like Alaska. It's looking like there won't be this massive blue wave in the Senate that some had predicted. So what does that mean for how the president is able to govern in terms of energy policy, whether it's President Trump or Joe Biden?
I think it's going to be a lot more moderate in its approach, but in reality, we're, for example, as I work with the Brownstein Group, I also do my own private investments, and that we're doing a hotel we're going to put solar energy on because it's going to save me money and be more cost effective. So I think there's this moderation on the energy policy that's going to happen versus I think there was this fear if it was a solid blue wave, suddenly tomorrow we'd be, off of carbon type fuels, which is never going to happen in the short term like that, that's for sure. But I think it will be more moderate in its effort. But I do think there are Republicans who understand the alternative and renewable energy opportunities and growing the economy with it. So it'll be a lot more balanced, I believe, on both sides. Because I think if you look at the map, look where the strength of the Biden votes are. They're in more western states, which actually, you look at some New Mexico, Colorado, these are energy states also. And so it's a very interesting kind of mix that you have to have in balancing.
Remarkable. All right, our thanks to Mark Begich, who is the former U.S. Senator from Alaska. And Anna, I just dusted off the old history book, so to speak. The last time a Democrat won the state of Arizona, you'd have to go all the way back to 1996 for Bill Clinton. Wow.
Yeah, really important development, and really important development for the market narrative as well, as we've gone through the overnight session and into Europe, Kevin, because we saw European futures were kind of in the red. We heard from President Trump, and then they really took a turn for the worse. We saw European futures moving to the downside as a result of what he had to say about the protracted nature of the legal battle that looked to still lie ahead. And then we heard from Arizona. Then we got confirmation from a second network. We'd already had it from one, but confirmation from a second network that Arizona had been won by the Democrats, and that seemed to take the edge off the losses. So we are still negative in Europe, but we're only down by 0.2%. And in the FTSE 100, we actually briefly moved into positive territory. That development, that pattern of things, really reflected in S&P futures as well. S&P futures turned negative, now back up just into positive territory, fairly flat. There's a lot we don't know still about election 2020. Our coverage continues. This is Bloomberg.
win this election. And we're feeling real good about Wisconsin and Michigan. And by the way, it's going to take time to count the votes. We're going to win Pennsylvania.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election. So our goal now is to ensure the integrity for the good of this nation. So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list.
I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington, D.C., alongside Anna Edwards in London, and this is Bloomberg's special coverage of the 2020 election results.
Let's get into the market conversation then, Kevin. We've got some of the results, of course, from the presidential election.
Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. As you can see, we sold Swiss franc at 0.9147 with nice profit, £2,000.
Europe, though, Danny, it seems that they were spooked by President Trump and the legal nature of the challenge that lies ahead, but then comforted by Arizona. What's been the story for Europe?
Certainly a knee-jerk reaction when we heard Trump say he would take this to the Supreme Court. That's when we got a leg lower, both in European futures at the time, heading into the open, and U.S. futures. But right now, this is really a story of value versus growth. And I know you're going to get sick of me talking about these factors, but look, banks are what's dragging this index down. Heavy volume today, selling European bank shares. Already 6 million shares of HSBC, nearly 7 million shares of HSBC, for example, have been traded, the biggest drag on the index. Its daily average is about 25 million, so we're already really ahead of numbers of where we are at this time of day. And the safety trade is firmly in, with healthcare leading the way. If you look at the 5 biggest gainers on the stock 600, every single one of them are healthcare companies when it comes to moves by points. So this is really a macro shift we're looking at in European markets. Yes, the main index itself might be easing off some of those losses, but that easing off is really being fueled by people jumping in to the healthcare trade, Anna.
Yeah, and let me ask you what's going on the NASDAQ then, because NASDAQ futures, nothing can keep them down, it seems, overnight. They looked as if they might go negative, Danny, but still found reason to be positive, and they're off highs, but still very strong. What's happening with the NASDAQ?
If you want to build a narrative about the NASDAQ, in the morning, very early this morning, when it looked like a blue wave was not possible, we had gains up to 3% in the NASDAQ, maybe hopes of less regulation, perhaps that idea of reflation unwinding, but what we've turned into is really one of safety. A lot of investors I've been speaking with this morning saying that they're going and looking at the NASDAQ, unwinding shorts, because it is that safe balance sheet trade, and that's what really people are looking for. On the flip side, you look at something like the Russell 2000, small cap, again, more risk, higher beta in that is tending to sell off. I think the VIX is really interesting today, too. If you're looking for market stress, you're really not going to find it anywhere here, really orderly market. But look, the VIX already priced very richly. A lot of volatility, traders expecting some turmoil. Perhaps they expected the idea of a contested election. They were pricing that in, perhaps the one corner of the market that had it right in terms of where things were going to land today. So not a lot of movement from there, Anna.
Yeah, maybe volatility traders had got it right where others had seen only the blue wave. Danny, thanks very much. Bloomberg's Danny Berger with a recap of where we are on the markets. Kevin, still a lot we don't know, still some big states left to call.
Exactly. And Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, increasingly a lot coming down to the wire in those particular states. And we might not have the results of those states in terms of the ballots until the next couple of hours or even a day or two. And where it stands right now in the race to 270 electoral votes is that Joe Biden has 238 compared to President Trump's 214. Now, there's still a path, Anna, for both President Trump and Joe Biden to to get to the magic number 270. But you look at the map, if you have a map in front of you for our radio audiences, I mean, you've got only a handful of states that are left, and it's going to be fascinating to watch just how both sides pressure not just the counting of those votes, but the legality surrounding that. Let's get some more perspective on this and bring into the conversation Bloomberg contributor Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital. He ran John McCain's 2008 presidential campaign. Rick, I mean, you and I were talking in the break just about how you've got some new information about where the Trump campaign might be looking to focus their legal fight. What do we know?
Yeah, it looks like the discussions we've been having here tonight with lawyers from around the country who are election law lawyers is that they will probably try to reenact the Supreme Court to get involved in the decision that they did not take last week, which was to determine whether or not Pennsylvania could count the ballots that arrived after Election Day. North Carolina has a similar provision that would likely be thrown in with Pennsylvania in this suit to the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court made its decision, it said it would review it again if it came up, if it was necessary. And so it sounds like Donald Trump's going to make it necessary, and that will likely be the case for the Supreme Court. That does not include likely the millions of absentee ballots and early voting that have stockpiled themselves in states like Pennsylvania and Michigan, and those would likely be counted over the course of the next couple of days.
In terms of just how significant this could be, to give some important background here, Rick, Judge Amy Coney Barrett did not participate in the Supreme Court's decision to not take up this case because she had just been confirmed to the bench of the Supreme Court in just a day or two. I mean, how significant of a role does Judge Amy Coney Barrett play specifically in this case?
Well, I think you've hit the nail right on the head. She wasn't involved in this case a week ago when they decided not to take it, and she would likely be someone who would want to weigh in on this. And so there will be justices who will vote for taking this case, even though it has not substantially changed. And so I think her inclusion, as you point out, could actually change the balance that could take this case. Whether it has any real effect on the outcome of the election is questionable.
presidential races, we'll have some comparative data to look at. Our thanks to Bloomberg contributor Rick Davis of Stonecourt Capital. Thanks for breaking all of that down. Anna, I mean, Rick just really touched on it. Coronavirus really could be making a play all the way up to the Supreme Court in terms of its effect on some of these key battleground states.
Yeah, in the age of technology, it seems amazing that the thing that gets us into trouble in 2020 in the US presidential election involves the postal service, involves voting by mail. It's quite incredible, isn't it? Almost retro. Let me get into our conversation about the markets now with Michael Strobeck, Global CIO at Credit Suisse. Michael, thanks so much for joining us this morning. 40 minutes then into the European trading session, and we seem to have calmed down slightly. As soon as we heard President Trump speak, futures started to move decidedly to the downside. There was a lot of concern about the legal battle that lies ahead. What kind of time horizon are you now putting on your investment strategies at this point?
I think, look, the next few days, you need to be patient in this environment. Obviously, markets are very nervous about the tail risk of a contested, prolonged sort of legal battle for this. Not clear at all that it could come to that, whether such case it will be accepted. You just discussed that. From a strategy perspective, I would not try to take sides on any of the outcome as to who becomes president. I think it's much more important now to look at the constellation of who becomes president and what does the Congress look like. And there, at least on the House side, it looks to be quite clear that that's going to the Democrats, and we'll see what happens on the Senate side. But I wouldn't exclude what the markets today are repricing, and that is still let's just call it a blue wave, light blue wave, in the sense that actually the Democrats still has some chance, but it's obviously now clear that it's much slimmer, that they could still sort of make a sweep. But the reactions of tech, the US dollar, Euro, and so on, really shows everybody thought it was more certain than it now is or looks to be.
Yes. Yeah, indeed. A lot of risk aversion evidence in markets. And in terms of positioning around equities then, Michael, let's try, if it's possible, to look 3-6 months ahead. You see reasons that equities go higher regardless of who is in the White House?
Yeah, I do. I mean, look, the backdrop of this election is still that we're in a pandemic that, however, has been solidly backstopped by monetary policy across the Western world. I don't see any reason why that should go away. Secondly, no matter what the election outcome will be, we're going to get a stimulus package out in the U.S. The ECB in Europe probably has to do more as well, because here we're in a sort of a really not great second wave of the pandemic. And therefore, you still have substantial stimulus sloshing around the system while the pandemic is upon us. And whatever the outcome of the election is, we will have a president, and it's going to be some tight days here. I hope not weeks, because that means just simply more volatility and so on and so forth. But ultimately, we will have someone in the seat, and we will have more stimulus coming out in the coming weeks ahead and months ahead.
And I see, in terms of your investment strategy then, Michael, I see that you prefer credit to government bonds. Does that still stand if we see difficulties perhaps in supporting business through the winter, if we have a slightly more divided Washington than had been anticipated?
Absolutely, it stands. I mean, our credit positioning is really more related to almost a solid backstop of credit by certainly the Fed. I wouldn't regard government bonds as any degree of safety in an asset allocation portfolio today as those rates sit. And therefore, I think that is the most sensible positioning in fixed income space. And any sort of contested sort of election outcome and battle that triggers sharp drawdowns in equity markets, I would use to buy.
You've said that you don't think the strength in the dollar, recent strength in the dollar, I think your team have said you don't expect that to last. This was before the events of the last 24 hours, Michael. But what is your expectation then for the dollar?
Well, we think it's going to go weaker, I say almost no matter what the outcome of this, because of certain sort of really powerful counter trends to the dollar. We have a fiscal situation in the U.S. which has gotten substantially worse because of the debt load that has been put onto the pandemic. We have more and more limited opportunity to increase that debt level. And I mean, the US dollar is the opposite side of that trade, to be honest. And why we're seeing a dollar strengthening today is because people simply had not reckoned with the probability so much higher that it could be so tight and that actually Trump could go and win. And the reason for that is a converse argument, and that is if Biden had won and swept, if you will, with the blue wave, the long rate would have probably gone more meaningfully up simply because of the stimulus that the Democrats would have put out in this. And this today, at least, looks less likely, and that's why we see this stronger dollar.
And that's what about other FX markets then, Michael? We see, you know, as a result of the move into the haven, into the dollar overnight, we've seen selling in all kinds of emerging market currencies. I suppose we need signals on broader risk appetite to dictate what happens there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the emerging market currency complex is the reverse of the US dollar. I mean, if the US dollar strengthens, that normally has not boded well for emerging markets in general. And if you, at the same time as we've seen these spikes up in long rates in the US, nothing other than a signal to emerging markets. Look, the outperformance, if you will, that many had anticipated in the face of a Biden election and or win has just really become extremely more uncertain, at least in the coming days here. And it's just too close to call, and that's why markets are now repricing.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Michael. Michael Stroback, Global CIO at Credit Suisse, giving us his early reaction, if that's the right phrase for it, when it comes to the US election. We don't know what exactly we're reacting to right now, do we? We've had many early results, but nothing definitive as yet on the presidential election in the US. But certainly it doesn't seem as if the blue wave is quite the phenomenon that markets had anticipated. And as a result, we saw some repricing of that blue wave assumption in markets. Stock 600 then, in fact, not Stock 600, S&P futures, this is what they look like. We saw them come down as a result of President Trump speaking and...
just waking up in terms of trying to figure out the dynamics of the Senate. You might have to wait until next year. Just explain that and how the runoffs and whatnot and the special elections really could push this thing all the way into January.
That's right. Well, Georgia already is sending one of its Senate seats to a runoff in January. That's for the special election. But then David Perdue, in the regularly scheduled election, if he drops below 50%, he would then go to a runoff as well with Democrat Jon Ossoff. And then you'd have an unprecedented 2 Senate races being decided in January. And it looks like the Senate is going to be a very close chamber. And so it's very likely that it will be decided in January.
All right. Our thanks to Kyle Tragside of Bloomberg Government. And Anna, I'll just say it again. I mean, historically speaking, the markets have performed better when there is divided government, Anna.
Yeah, it's certainly a phenomenon to watch, isn't it? Sometimes when there is nobody to make changes, to make rules, to increase taxes or decrease them, markets do their thing. Now, Kevin, throughout the night, we've been covering issues of particular interest to those on Wall Street and in the business community, of course. We have called it Wall Street Votes, and we welcome Kaylee Lines in New York to take us through or to start us off with a look at the economy and the markets. Kaylee.
Well, Anna, as the old saying goes, it's the economy, stupid, when it comes to presidential elections. And the two candidates, Joe Biden and President Trump, have very different views on how the economy looks right now. Just take a listen to some things they've said recently.
I will be the greatest jobs president that God ever created.
I'll be an ally of the light, not the darkness. It's time for us, for we the people, to come together. And make no mistake, united we can and will overcome this season of darkness in America.
So Joe Biden talking about darkness, but President Trump often during this campaign has said that the pre-pandemic economy was actually the greatest in history. Let's just dive into those numbers a little bit more, though, because it is true that under President Trump's first term, the unemployment rate had fallen to historic lows, actually hitting as low as 3.5% in late 2019. But it already was on a downward trajectory before he took office. And of course, that equation has changed dramatically due to the pandemic, with tens of millions losing their jobs. And while the unemployment rate has improved, it is still far higher than it was earlier in President Trump's term. And when it comes to people of color, President Trump has said he's been the best president for Black Americans since Abraham Lincoln. And we do know that in the first 3 years of his term, the poverty rate for Black Americans fell below 20% for the first time in post-World War II history. And the unemployment rate for Black workers fell below 6% for the first time in records, going all the way back to 1972. It fell for Latinx workers as well. Another subsector of the economy that Trump has really focused on when it comes to jobs is manufacturing. He promised to stop the offshoring of American jobs and bring about a major manufacturing revival, but it didn't really take shape. The fact of the matter is there are actually fewer employees in the manufacturing sector now than there were when the president took office. There was a small increase during the first 2 years of his term, but it had started falling even before the coronavirus pandemic. So that's a look at the economy, and we know that the economy and the stock market are not the same thing, but the market has become one of President Trump's favorite things to tout. It is true the S&P 500 has hit a record 146 times since Trump's inauguration back in 2016, but financial asset prices aren't always indicative of the health of the underlying economy. And while equity investors have reaped the benefit of higher stock prices, there is still wide swaths of the American public that has not felt that at all.
Kaylee, thanks very much. Bloomberg's Kaylee Lines there in New York with a look at the last few years and the manufacturing story, the jobs story. Kevin, we should just draw attention as this hour comes to a close to a couple of statements we're getting out from the Biden campaign. The Trump statement was outrageous and unprecedented. This in reference to President Trump earlier on today saying that, frankly, we did win. This is a major fraud and he wants to stop the count. But Joe Biden's team also saying that lawyers are standing ready if Trump does go to the Supreme Court. And that's where we need to focus on the near term, on a few counts that still have to come in, but then also on the legal challenge.
Precisely. And let's bring in Bloomberg contributor Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital, who, of course, ran John McCain's 2008 presidential campaign. Rick, the Supreme Court back in 2000, it took more than a month. It was on December 12th of that year of 2000 that the Supreme Court ruled on this. So if it does get to the Supreme Court this go around, historically speaking, it could take several weeks.
Yeah, in They're under pressure to do it so that they can meet the electoral vote counts that have to be presented to Congress as evidence of the outcome of the campaign. So they are wedded to those dates in November and December, and these are constitutional dates. These are not dates set by the federal government and can be changed by Congress. These are constitutionally set dates. So in order to present the winner of this election to Congress to be certified, they have to be able to fit inside that timetable.
Rick, thanks very much. Thanks for joining us. Bloomberg contributor Rick Davis staying up late for us stateside from Stone Court Capital, along with Kevin, of course. In terms of the market reaction then, Kevin, we're kind of in limbo now, waiting, aren't we? We had the announcement about the legal action from President Trump, the fact that he thinks he's still got something to fight for here. We still have a number of states that we haven't heard about. In amongst all of that, equity markets and risk assets sold off and now have regained some of that momentum. NASDAQ futures pointing to the upside, up by 2.4%. A lot still we don't know then, Kevin, about the 2020 election.
Precisely, but here's what we do know. In the race to 270, it stands at Biden 238, Trump 214. And again, the biggest unknown is what pressure does the volatility on the election mean for fiscal stimulus in the immediate short term. All right, that's it for the European Open. And stay with Bloomberg Television because up next, it's surveillance. And we will be tracking this every which way as the battleground states and the results continue to come in. And President Trump threatens now to take it to the Supreme Court. I'm Kevin Cirilli. This is Bloomberg.
Good morning, everyone around this world. Francine Lacroix and Tom Keene, election 2020, and it is late in the American evening, much later than it was in 2016. Across America, there are undecided outcomes in the House. The Senate's still undecided, very different than what was expected. And the great battle between Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden in the coming hours, indeed, possibly the coming days, a careful counting of mail-in ballots. Mr. Biden asks that every vote be counted. Mr. Trump says he will go to the Supreme Court. Good morning, everyone. Writing that script because the news is flowing here in this hour. Francine Lacroix, it's pretty much as we expected, and we've not only seen the political results, but the market gyrations in the last 12 hours.
Well, Tom, I think there are two outcomes that the market were really fearful about, and those outcomes became much more possible in the last 24 hours. First, it's a Joe Biden presidency with a Republican Senate. We could have that. It's still mathematically possible. And the other one is, of course, a very contested election. If you listen to what President Trump said about an hour and 10 minutes ago, it was very clear that he wanted to go to the Supreme Court, to ask the Supreme Court to step in because he feels this is illegitimate. Unclear why, Tom, because we're still counting votes. So there is absolutely no evidence at the moment that something has been done wrong, but certainly fighting words from President Trump, and that will put the markets on edge.
Well, we welcome you all worldwide, and looking at the markets now, red and green on the screen within the gyrations. NASDAQ 100 does a little bit better, a huge tech surge coming off what at first looked like a Trump wave, and that has reversed nicely. Let us listen to the two candidates in the last hour.
We'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list. We will win this.
We believe we're on track to win this election. And we're feeling real good about Wisconsin and Michigan. And by the way, it's going to take time to count the votes. We're going to win Pennsylvania.
Really quite something to see, and I really can't emphasize enough the originality of this moment for the nation. You go back to 1888, Grover Cleveland losing to Harrison in what was an incredibly close election, and of course 1960 as well. Right now, again, with futures up 19, I'm really going to step away from the market right now. Yields, yes, they've moved, and other than that, it's just a churning, waiting to see the news work out. Through the evening, clearly working bankers hour. I'm working bankers hours. They're working political hours. Is our Kevin Cirilli, our chief Washington correspondent, and of course providing huge value. Rick Davis with Republican perspective, his service to Senator McCain of Arizona. Kevin, let me start with you, just with what you've learned in the last hour. And I want to go to one thing, Kevin, that I saw from Chip Gabriel and the team at the New York Times, that of 13,000 mail-in ballots in Erie, Pennsylvania, the ratio was 5-1 Biden. Does a pro like you assume that all the mail-in ballots will have a stark ratio like that?
Well, Erie County is a county that was flipped in 2016, and that Trump was able to beat Hillary Clinton in that Obama carried. So Erie County, incredibly important, and the data that has come in from the early mail-in ballots has suggested that typically Democrats were trending to have cast their early votes in advance and disproportionate compared to Republicans. Just within the last half hour, though, the Biden campaign releasing a statement, headlines crossing the Bloomberg terminal. President Trump's statement was outrageous, they called it, and unprecedented. But I can tell you, based upon my own reporting, is that President Trump might leave Washington, D.C. in the next couple of days, Tom. You can expect to see him back in battleground states like Pennsylvania, like North Carolina. We still don't have a result. Georgia, another key battleground state. Michigan, Wisconsin. All of these types of dynamics now as we head into overtime, essentially, for lack of a better phrase. Both of the campaigns are going to be meeting with their legal teams. And this is reminiscent. You went back for historical context, but this is reminiscent of 2000. And I would say this: if you're trying to figure out where this thing is going, for how long, this could take. In 2000, it took until December 12th of 2000 for the Supreme Court to issue a ruling. So while we might wait a couple of days to get the results in the battlegrounds, Tom, like in Erie County, it could take a couple of weeks for it to make its way through the courts.
Rick Davis, when you look at the latest electoral vote count, and I'm looking just to make sure that I have the latest numbers, Biden 238, Trump 213, we're expecting, of course, the counts in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Georgia to take a bit of time. Is it all to play now, or do you have a hunch of who could become president?
Well, I think both these candidates could become president today. It's pretty clear that Biden is probably going to rack up Arizona and Nevada, and right now Donald Trump leads in Georgia and North Carolina. All four of those states haven't been officially called, but they probably get divided up, which means the winner of this contest will win one of the two or two of the three remaining Midwestern states that are up for grabs. So this is a very tight race in the Electoral College. They've been tight races inside these states, and even the national numbers aren't that far apart. So this is a pretty close race, and it is far from being over. There are millions of votes in key battleground states left undecided that have not been counted yet.
I want to frame two statistical moments now. I'll start with Mr. Davis because he's better looking than an exhausted Cirilli. Rick Davis, I look at the popular vote, and it's real simple. I would suggest what I see right now, that the president is doing better in the national popular vote than he did 4 years ago. He took 46.1% final count, and now he has 48.5. Now, that may come down a little bit, I see, but can you state that Mr. Trump has done better this time around with the national vote than last time?
Yeah, and I think in this case, everybody voting floats all the boats. In other words, we've had a massive voter turnout today, and it's been building over the last month with these early votes. And so what you're seeing is that people who haven't voted in 2 presidential elections, 3 presidential elections, came out and voted in this one. And that helped Donald Trump. It improved his numbers with voters of color, of people in urban areas, votes that he didn't get last time. But it also helped support Joe Biden's race. And Joe Biden overperformed with the elderly, which allowed him to compete in places like Arizona so well.
I got about 8 ways to go here, but with Kevin, I'm going to go to Nevada, Kevin. I know you've been covering that. Aaron Kessler reporting for Bloomberg. I love this, Kevin. They've got 67% counted. They had 1.05 million early ballots. They had the same 1.09 million counted so far, and the delta's 30,000 between the two candidates. That really shows, Kevin, the tension of these mail-in ballots, doesn't it?
It's Harry Reid versus Sheldon Adelson in Nevada and Clark County, just specifically where overwhelmingly that state's population, where Las Vegas is, of course, going to be so incredibly important to turn out there. I would bring up the Senate spread, Tom, in particular, because regardless of what we know this morning is that the Senate is going to be much more close. We don't know the precise numbers. We actually will not know the precise tally because of the runoffs until early January. But with what we do know is that people like Senator Joni Ernst won. She's the Republican incumbent in Iowa. Steve Daines in Montana, a Republican incumbent, he won. Lindsey Graham was able to win his seat in South Carolina, another Republican. Arizona, Mark Kelly defeating Republican Senator Martha McSally. But either way, even someone like a Mark Kelly, a maverick of sorts from the state of Arizona, he's going to have to govern in a more centrist way. So the Senate not trending too far to the left as of now. We still, of course, have a handful of seats left remaining.
Kevin, what happened in Florida and what happened to the Latino vote?
Well, Cuban Catholic Americans clearly broke for President Trump, and the dynamics of the Hispanic vote, as Republicans have said for quite some time, is not a monolithic community, and that was on display with regards to Florida. The president was also able to perform well in the more inland parts of the state. He was also able to make some inroads, quite frankly, with senior citizens, a constituency that Joe Biden had been trending for quite some time. That was a must-win state for President Trump. And if he didn't win Florida, we wouldn't be having any of these conversations about a contested election up into the Supreme Court. He did it, and that as a result of that, his path to 270 still exists.
But Rick, so President Trump said that he wants the Supreme Court to actually step in. What would he ask them to step in on?
So he will probably resurrect a case that was brought to the Supreme Court last week, originally from Pennsylvania, but likely would include North Carolina and a couple other states. And what that was a request to not count ballots that arrived after Election Day. In other words, you mailed it. There was a delay in getting it there, and it arrived on the 4th or 5th. And the Supreme Court chose not to hear that case. Now, they also said if it becomes a problem, bring it back to us. And so there's no doubt that Donald Trump's going to bring that case back to them. The reality is it doesn't stop the counting of the votes that are already underway in any of those states.
It is critically important that the markets stay open in this time, as opposed to trying to take breaks in the middle. I think that that'll just push off the situation a little bit, but actually could create other pent-up issues if you do close the markets.
I'm placing the order to buy Japanese yen at the price 104.940. Okay, for the place to buy this price Japanese yen.
Yeah, okay. Tom, I don't know if you can hear me.
I hear you.
So, Tom, there's a good point that's going around, basically saying that, Trump has just ensured that whether he wins or loses, so many Americans will think that the vote is illegitimate, and that will just crush confidence in a lot of the institutions going forward.
This has been an ancient sport in America. The distinction is that never before has the actual candidate been so vocal. The tradition is the candidate remains silent and people underneath them and around them do all the yelling and screaming, and particularly the legal actions. But he thrives in doing this. And that's the huge distinction. We've never had the actual candidate do the yelling and screaming and threatening. That's what's original.
Yeah.
And he'll get crushed in court.
Yeah.
We continue our coverage of the American election. Francine Lacroix and Tom Keene, a quick data check here, and we'll come back with more good conversation. Yields move, curve flattening, and the real yield is a broader real yield, a deeper negative yield. I'd really note as well, Francine, the German 10-year yield has really worked down to new, recent, larger negative yield. It's off the radar, but to me, that's important. I look, Francine, as well, the red and the green on the screen. NASDAQ 100 with that huge surge. What was it? I've lost track of time. 12 hours ago, a pullback, and now again, NASDAQ 100 showing some huge movement versus a flat Dow Jones Industrial Average. One other idea, Francine, I know you want to comment on oil with a lift 2 days in a row.
Yeah, I want to comment on oil, Tom, but actually what I picked out this morning was two currencies that could really move. I know a lot has been baked in, a lot has been priced in, but actually I wanted to show you a renminbi and I wanted to show you Mexican peso. Now, they could move if we have President Trump for another 4 years. And just in general, Tom, if you look at, the two election scenarios that could actually hunt the markets, and we had been talking about it for quite some time, is a contested election, which there's a big probability that we could see, or Joe Biden presidency with a Republican Senate. So those are two things that look more likely since yesterday's voting that we need to keep an eye on. And then, of course, we continue looking at the states where we could see a while or take a while to vote counting. For the moment, if you look at the Electoral College so far, Biden still seems to be favored. But, of course, the trailing candidate is very close. Now, coming up on Bloomberg Surveillance, we speak with David Harrow, Harris Associates Chief Investment Officer. I'm looking forward to that interview. It's coming up in 1 hour from now, 6:30 a.m. in New York, 11:30 a.m. in London, and this is Bloomberg.
another day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television.
I was actually poor.
No foreplay?
Eat your bag of Lay's with a smile on your face.
If all the diseases have been taken, I'll take a tax.
The order to buy Japanese yen was cancelled.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Tom and Francine from London and New York. And here's the latest on the U.S. election. Democrat Joe Biden has won the usual Republican state of Arizona. He has a small lead in the Electoral College, but there are still some key battlegrounds yet to announce. Now, President Trump has won the swing states of Florida, Ohio, and held on to Texas. Pennsylvania may not report its final result for days. Biden is also still optimistic and confident of a victory.
We believe we're on track to win this election. And we're feeling real good about Wisconsin and Michigan. And by the way, it's going to take time to count the votes. We're going to win Pennsylvania.
And President Trump is already claiming victory despite key races still to be called. He'll also say he'll go to the Supreme Court.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election. So our goal now is to ensure the integrity for the good of this nation. So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list.
Well, the Democrats look set to maintain control of the House. The Senate is more of a mixed bag for them, with several vulnerable Republicans holding on to their seats. Now, joining us is Lindsay Newman, an independent senior political analyst, formerly at Chatham House. Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us. When you look at the latest electoral college votes, when you look at the number of states that still have to vote, or that still have to count the votes, and that will take a couple of days, does Joe Biden still have a slight edge right now?
Joe Biden is ahead. Bloomberg is putting him at 238 to 213 with Trump. Both Trump and Vice President Biden have pathways to that 270 number. He's trailing in 5 of those key battleground states: Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, et cetera. But the voting is still, this is potentially, we're in that red mirage phase. We don't know. They're going to be looking at areas of each of those states now that are more likely to have voted blue, more likely to have voted Democrat.
What's the lesson, Lindsay, of what we heard? Are the polls wrong? There was a lot of analysis actually predicting this outcome. Initially a bit of a red wave, and then as we count a lot of the people that sent in the ballots by mail, it could, possibly turn the fortunes of Joe Biden.
So there's going to be a ton of forensic over the next couple of days, over the couple of weeks, about where the polls stood, how accurate they were, what sort of areas in which they let us down potentially, as we did in 2016. For me, one of the key takeaways is that we are still hamstrung. We are still vulnerable to what the polls are telling us. It was very clear, according to the polls, that the Democrats should sweep both chambers of Congress as well as the presidency. And it's clearly not where we are right now. The headline is that we are not seeing a landslide for the Democrats or for President Trump.
Lindsay Newman, on December 13th, I sat at the dining room table with 5 newspapers in front of me in red Bush v. Gore. I read the decision from the day before. Of course, Al Gore gave a concession speech, et cetera, et cetera. Can you imagine how any court, the federal courts, the circuit court, or the U.S. Supreme Court will process or act at this political moment?
So, Tom, I thought you might just ask me something about Bush v. Gore. What I would say is a couple of things. The first is we're not in Bush v. Gore territory. That was about a recount. What we saw President Trump say in his overnight address to the nation was talking about stopping the counting of votes that have yet to be counted in the first instance. So we are not in Bush v. Gore territory in that sense. We have to remember the whole judiciary has moved rightward, has moved more conservative under Trump. That is going to be, whether he is reelected or not, one of his key legacies is not just the Supreme Court, but across the federal benches. They have had hundreds of conservative judges appointed successfully. But we've seen so far that there has been a very mixed result around these efforts from conservatives to curb and curtail mail-in balloting and absentee balloting extensions, and just generally the through line of the Supreme Court, at least with cases not just Bush v. Gore but other precedent, is around respecting state-level practice around how they conduct and count elections. So it seems unlikely. Sorry.
No, I don't mean to cut you. I thought you were done. I'm sorry, but everybody's tired. Lindsay, I think what's so important here, out of the Texas Supreme Court of a few days ago, is things moved quickly. Do you assume that if there is a legal process, it will be at relative legal light speed?
There are benchmarks set into the system, set into the constitutional process, I should say, around when the electoral college voters will meet in December. January 20th, the next president has to be inaugurated. So there will be swift assessments and judiciary rulings around anything related to this particular vote. Sort of larger questions around voting practice that could carry on for years to come.
Lindsay, I'm looking at a lot of the press and experts weighing in on the polls and not the polls. And one thing seems very clear is that actually a lot of people that voted by mail were overwhelmingly Democrats. If that's the case, is it more likely that actually, some of these key battlegrounds that we're waiting for, the 3 and 4 that we don't know who will go to, will most likely go to Joe Biden, or is it just impossible to call?
Well, I would say it's too early to call. We know that Nevada is leaning towards Vice President Biden. And if he secures Nevada, he just needs Wisconsin. He needs either Georgia, Michigan, or Wisconsin. He wouldn't even need Pennsylvania and its 20 electoral college votes, although I'm sure he would love to have it. So there is this theory, and we're waiting to see whether there was this red mirage. Certainly the early voting tally that we know suggests, as you say, that Democrats did use the mail-in voting more than Republicans did. But it remains to be seen whether when the actual vote count comes through, whether those states that are currently leaning red, currently leaning towards Trump, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, are they going to switch? And that's the big question, which we may or may not have the answer to even today. They're trying, a lot of the states are trying to count quickly, but this may be a couple days before we have a full, clear picture on these outcomes.
Lindsay Newman, thank you so much for joining us this morning, senior political analyst. Really appreciate the perspective. I really want to appreciate that the markets is one of the litmus papers of the news flow here, and we've seen a decisive turn with futures now all green. S&P futures up 46, Dow futures all of a sudden up 148, and NASDAQ 100 puts it on again. I'll have to get a percentage on that, but it's a solid 3% move. And the yield space, yields churning is what I would call it, with the VIX, that equity measurement off SPX, 33.71. Coming up on Bloomberg Surveillance, let us get the perspective of the Pentagon and of our military worldwide. James Stavridis will join us, and of course, an important election 2020 interview. Through the day, perspective, and of course, the results from America. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Matt, I need people talking in my ear more with results. Well, there's something going on. Look, the market's on fire, so there's something going on. I mean, I don't know what else to say. What's going on?
They're expecting Wisconsin, Tom.
Okay. Who can we cite? Okay, listen to me. Francine and I must see that when it comes around. That's not good enough because I'm out here
but
blind.
Tom, Nates,
the two
that you should
Nates.
follow on Twitter right now, that Nate Cohn says that, you know, based on what he's been saying, he says people have not fully internalized how democratic these mail and absent ballots will be in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. So he believes that it's going to be close, but that Joe Biden could get the presidency. Again, Tom, this is speculation. We don't know, but certainly that's the chatter, that there were so many mail-in ballots that take a bit longer to count, to fully count, than when you go in person and vote, that actually it could give a slight advantage to Joe Biden. We'll have to wait and see. We can't speculate, but certainly that's the mood or the feeling out there in the market.
And the mood there, and again, I can't convey, folks, the volatility in the equity futures now. The Dow has just slammed to a negative 13, so there's huge swings here in the equity market. I do want to point out, to Francine's great perspective, the New York Times with a single sentence on Erie, Pennsylvania, talking about 13,000 mail-in ballots that were 5-1 for the Democratic candidate. So that'll be the perspective. And Kevin Cirilli nailed it by saying his focus was on Wisconsin. In Arizona, in Phoenix, Arizona, is our Edward Ludlow, of course, working out of San Francisco, and he's looking north to Nevada as well. Ed Ludlow, Nevada is still very much up for grabs, isn't it?
Yeah, the Associated Press are reporting that with 67% of the vote, Biden has a small lead. But again, this is one of those states where we could be waiting days. Clerks in the state, in particular counties, have until November 10th to receive ballots, even if they were dated on election day, and November 12th to count them. And, you know, there has been some litigation around this ongoing between various parties, but clerks in the state are saying, look, we have days, wait for the result. It could be a week before you get it.
Well, the mail-in ballot debate in Las Vegas, and with all the different back and forth of a Republican heritage and the Democratic Las Vegas unions and that, let's keep it simple here, Ed Ludlow. The basic idea of Nevada is they've got to count mail-in ballots. Do you assume that they're union ballots from Las Vegas, or is it a mystery what they are?
They are mail-in ballots, as simple as that. All we have to go on is what the state has communicated to us, not just today, but yesterday as well, that they have until November 10th to receive them, even if they're dated on election day, and they have a November 12th to count them. And the communication has been very clear from the state of Nevada that you will have to wait to get a result out of us.
And how long can we wait? Are we talking days? Are we talking like weeks or even months?
No, look, the briefing basically is that it will be the case of a week, up to a week. I don't think necessarily anyone's suggesting that will be the case that we're waiting weeks and weeks. That they have already made some progress in counting. You're looking at around a million mail votes, right? But they think that this is the process that's underway. They want to count every single vote, and that is the briefing. November 10th to receive them, November 12th to count them.
Ed, looking at Arizona, is it too soon to say, the mail-in ballots, who they voted for, and can you break down, for example, the kind of people that voted for a Democratic president versus the kind of people that voted for President Trump?
Yeah, look, early mail-in.
Climate change is the defining issue of our time, so we've redefined how we cover it. With clear data and rigorous journalism, we rise to the scale of the challenge to reveal the breadth of possibility. We look at stories from every angle to provoke debate, spotlight solutions, and make sense of the greatest crisis of our generation. Bloomberg Green, solutions for a changing climate.
It is critically important that the markets stay open in this time, as opposed to trying to take breaks in the middle. I think that that'll just push off the situation a little bit, but actually could create other pent-up issues if you do close the markets.
And checked in on a number of sources that understand this better than anyone here in Europe, and it could really be a democratic tilt of the votes coming in through mail, the early voting. So something that we need to keep an eye on, and maybe that's what the markets, Tom, are looking at and moving on the back of.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I want to make clear, folks, our key phrase here is AP reports, and AP has not reported any of the decisions in these very close contested races, but people are looking at the dynamics, the mystery, if you will, Francine, of this original election, which is the mail-in ballots.
Tom, with great perspective, coming up in the next hour, Leslie Vinjamuri, Chatham House Head of U.S. and America's Program. I know that she'll be great, of course, at everything to do with the mail-in ballots. We'll talk Wisconsin, we'll talk Michigan, and we'll talk Pennsylvania. That's coming up shortly, and this is Bloomberg.
Francine? Francine?
Tom?
That was spectacular. What you did there was absolutely superb.
Tom, I'm blushing. Actually, I'm not because I have so much makeup, but otherwise I would be.
Wonderful, wonderful. Kieran, are you there? Kieran, are you there? Okay, he's right in IB. Okay, I just, as clear as I can, Francine and I need to be informed about what's going on. Okay? No and if or buts. Yep. Just give us the rumors and we'll decide what to do. Francine nailed that. Mark Cudmore, where are you? Are you in Singapore?
I'm always in Singapore, unfortunately now, because I'm trapped.
Hi, Mark Cudmore.
Great to have you on.
How are you doing?
another day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lack in London, Tom Keene in New York. A lot going on. Of course, the election outcome still unknown as the ballot counting continues. Trump has falsely claimed victory. He wants the court to stop the count. Biden did urge patience, saying he's confident that he'll win. Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Georgia tallies may take some time. And the latest electoral college vote count, Biden 238 and Trump 213. Tom, we focus on the markets, and we're expecting possibly Wisconsin to come shortly.
It's going to be interesting. Election 2020. We welcome all of you. A real international focus here. The ramifications for America and, of course, for markets. I can't convey enough. Can't find words for the volatility we're seeing in the markets. Futures now up 19. The Dow is red and green all over the place with a persistent NASDAQ lift as well. There's a lot going on. We're going to get to Wisconsin in a moment and with our Greg Giroux. But first, let us listen to the candidates.
We already have one.
I'm here to tell you tonight, we believe we're on track to win this election.
We won states that we weren't expected to win. Florida, we didn't win it. We won it by a lot.
It's going to take time to count the votes. We're going to win Pennsylvania.
So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop.
We're going to have to be patient until the hard work of tallying the votes is finished.
The candidates, that was about 90 minutes ago, maybe 2 hours ago in that realm, that theme. Right now, Greg Giroux with us. He's truly expert on elections. We could have 6 conversations with him this morning. But Greg, Cirilli told me 3 days ago, go to Wisconsin. Cirilli, of course, was right. And the bombshell of Milwaukee and 169,000 ballots is what has shifted the tone here as well. Does a pro like you right now have any understanding of the mail-in ballots that remain in Green Bay, the mail-in ballots in Georgia, Pennsylvania, and the rest, or is it really we're blind until we see them?
Well, in some states, it's hard to say how many votes are outstanding. Michigan still has a lot of votes to count in some big population areas like Wayne County in and around Detroit, Oakland County, a suburb of Detroit where Biden is doing well, Grand Rapids, Kent County. So it's hard to say how many votes are left. But in Wisconsin, we had that big batch of votes, of absentee votes in Milwaukee that put Biden slightly ahead in Wisconsin. He should get a boost out of Kenosha and Green Bay. The question is, how many outstanding ballots are there in Republican-leaning areas? That's why Wisconsin is still too close to call right now.
Greg, I'm looking at the betting markets, and I think Joe Biden just went favored in the betting markets. So I just want to, temper expectations because we're still counting, but this seems like a massive move, and it happened about 3-4 minutes ago. Greg, can we say with some certainty that actually the mail-in ballots, the early voting, it was overwhelming for the Democratic candidate?
Yes, well, in those upper Midwestern states we're looking at, Wisconsin, Michigan, industrial Midwest, Pennsylvania, what we saw was a very strong Republican vote on Election Day, and those states are not counting the mail-in ballots until like later this morning and for the rest of the week, and those ballots are going to trend strongly Democratic. and we saw with Biden overtaking Trump in Wisconsin by a narrow margin. Michigan, there are a lot of pro-Biden votes still out there, and there's still a lot of votes to be counted in Pennsylvania. So Wisconsin, Biden pulling ahead was a good sign for him. So that's probably why we saw some movement there.
A less than 10,000 vote difference right now in Wisconsin. Greg Giroux, thank you so much with Bloomberg Government. Too short a visit in too many states to speak to you about. I'm watching in real time the Michigan results, folks. Vice President Biden, 49.3%, the president, 49%. And there's a third candidate in Wisconsin of great interest, Jo Jorgensen, and she makes up the difference, 37,000 votes for her, and the delta here is only about 10,000 votes. That's a good entry point with Wendy Schiller of Brown University, one of our great historians on elections and also in the present tense as well. Wendy, is this going to be about third-party candidates getting in the way of razor-thin margins?
Well, I think it's also going to be, I mean, it could be that, right? But it could also be sort of not great turnout among certain constituencies for the Democratic Party. We know that African-American turnout might not have hit that magic 64% or higher mark in some of these states, particularly Michigan and Pennsylvania. And also maybe fewer defections from seniors. We're seeing exit polling that indicates that they stuck with Republicans when the polling all along indicated that they might flip to the Democrats in terms of voting more for Biden than for Trump. So I think there could be a combination of things going on here, but it could just be if Trump emerges to be reelected, that he managed to get his coalition to get out the door and stick with him and bring on some new voters that, the Democrats didn't either target or missed, and that Biden's coalition just didn't come out in enough force to give him the victory.
Well, I know Donna Shalala losing down in Miami-Dade is well in a closely contested race there. To talk then of Mr. Biden's core constituency, what would you identify it as tonight? Is it truly about the suburbs?
It looks to be that if he can pull this out and if he can win, it will be the suburbs, and it will be probably white women in the suburbs that give him the ultimate victory, particularly in these Midwestern states. And we're looking at Latinos. George W. Bush did very well with Latinos, and Mitt Romney did pretty well with Latinos. Not great, but about 29-30%. It looks like Trump might exceed that. He might actually get a greater percentage of Latino vote. And I think that's where the Biden campaign probably missed its mark the most. You see that in Nevada, and you saw that in Florida. Now, Latinos are not monolithic, so it's hard to target a campaign towards all Latinos. But it just looks like the Biden campaign did not do what it had to do in that community just to stay competitive with some of the previous Democratic candidates.
Wendy, before I ask you a question, I just want to bring everyone up to date with some of the latest betting that we saw. It was interesting, Tom, speaking to Mark Cudmore, saying that actually more than the Twitter accounts that we follow, looking at electoral maps, maybe what the market is following is the betting odds. And he did tell me that Joe Biden went briefly onto the favorite, very briefly, but now it's back for a narrow victory by President Trump. But Wendy, I guess my question to you is, when you look at how close, right? So mathematically, at some point we'll have a president, but the race is so close. How contested will this be? How ugly can this be? Like, what will the Supreme Court have to decide on?
Well, so this is the question mark. Trump barely won in 2016, right? He won by a total of less than, I think, 90,000 or 100,000 votes, and the margin in Michigan was less than 11,000 votes. So, for a guy who won by razor-thin margins, if Biden wins by razor-thin margins, I think it's going to be a difficult public campaign for Trump to make. And it's unclear what the issues that the Supreme Court would consider. Have them in voting irregularities? Do you stop counting before all the ballots are counted? I don't think states are going to be willing to do that. So I don't understand the president's strategy. I mean, he's probably, right now, it looks like he's going to win. So even if all the votes are counted, it looks like he might, pretty much going to win. Why insert this controversy into this so soon into the game? Because I think it will affect the next 4 years if he does, in fact, win. And it puts Republicans in a bad spot, I think.
Wendy, going back to what you were saying about that, Latino vote and the fact that it's very diverse and very different, does the single attribute of President Trump calling Joe Biden and his campaign socialist, could that have won a big pocket of that faction for him?
Well, I think there are two different things. I think the sort of socialist moniker in areas with a lot of Latino immigrants from Latin America in particular, apparently, in Florida, Venezuelans in particular, and certainly Cubans, I think that could tilt and probably did tilt them against Biden. But in Nevada, you have a lot of Latinos, but you also have, a hospitality industry and a gaming industry that's really crushed right now because of restrictions associated with COVID. So if you're thinking about your livelihood and you're thinking about which president is more likely to try to open up the economy, Trump has always rated better in the last 6 months on that than Biden, even towards the very end. So in that sense, it may not be necessarily being Latino, but it may be that which industries you work in and which state you live in actually tilted you back to Trump.
Very good. And I made a mistake there, folks. I was, of course, insulting all the people of Wisconsin. I mentioned Michigan there at one point, and most definitely it was Wisconsin that we're focused on right now as well. Green Bay, Wisconsin, absentee ballot results, they are delayed. One of the vote counting machines literally ran out of ink. And I can tell you, I have a family member in New York. They had exactly the same problem at a New York precinct here about 7 hours ago, I'm guessing, where they literally ran out of ink. I guess that can happen to the machines. Francine from London emails in and says that happens at the printer at the Lacroix House all the time as well. Professor Schiller, one final question, if I may. As you well know and are expert at, it's about negative votes. Do you know now, or when will you know, where they said, I'm never going to vote for Biden or I'm never going to vote for Trump?
Well, I think there's something called negative partisanship, which is exactly what you're talking about, which is sort of I'm never going to vote for the other side. And I think that, Biden was counting on intense negativity towards Trump, and Trump was always counting on positive attitudes towards him from his base and from other voters who he could probably persuade. That's what he was always messaging. He was always selling that. And, sometimes enthusiasm comes from positive, not negative. And I think that's sort of, if Biden loses, that's the lesson of this campaign. And the Democrats will have to regroup and think about what they're going to do in 2024. But if this is a narrow victory, if Trump doesn't win all three big Midwestern states, then he doesn't really have a mandate. He didn't really run on much policy to begin with, but he doesn't really have a mandate. And I think that's going to be a complicated governing situation for the president and the Republicans at the national level going forward.
It is going to be a complicated set of hours and days. Wendy Schiller of Brown University, thank you so much for joining us in the very early Rhode Island morning. Futures are red and green on the screen now. We're looking at just the flightiness of the futures is extraordinary. We do have curve flattening, indicating that dampening of the market. As I mentioned earlier, of all things, a German 10-year yield giving me some new lows there, some real negative tone on the ever more negative tone on the German 10-year yield. That's the data, but we're looking at the politics. We've got much more to come on these important states in good conversation. Leslie Vinjamuri will join us from Chatham House on Wisconsin, on America. Stay with us, election 2020. This is Bloomberg.
Women leaders were actually better at controlling the deaths from COVID-19. Do you think out of this pandemic, we'll see more countries be willing to elect female leaders?
When we look at women leaders, we tend to project on them baggage that they shouldn't bear.
Women are given an opportunity when no one else wants to do the job.
Women had a very clear objective. They wanted to save lives.
The women leaders, if you look at their careers, have also built up a level of trust.
In fact, women have to be
better at communication in order to be elected as leaders, whereas this doesn't hold true for men.
We need to get those sexist stereotypes out of our head and give women a fair run for leadership.
Trying to change the stereotypes about women is not only the business of women, but men have to be part of it.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom and Francine from London and New York. This is also our U.S. election special 2020. And joining us now is Leslie Vinjer-Murray with great and much-needed perspective. She's from Chatham House, where she's U.S. and the Americas Program Director. Leslie, I know you've been up for most of the night looking at the Electoral College, looking at the number of votes counted. And for the moment, I guess it's too close to call. The election outcome is still unknown. But what has surprised you the most, Leslie? Can we safely say that the votes that came in by mail were overwhelmingly for the Democrats? And does that mean that Joe Biden has an advantage right now?
That's what everybody who follows this very, very carefully at the highest levels has told us. They've been telling us for a very long time. Francine, the thing that surprises me most, we've heard this for weeks, and yet on the night, on the morning, people still have a hard time absorbing it and waiting for the result. We have to wait for Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. We've known for a very long time that the mail-in ballots would take more time to count. They only began in Pennsylvania counting on election day. We've known that more Democrats are likely to be voting by mail-in balloting. We know that there's been an extraordinary turnout across the United States, so there are more ballots to count on both sides. So I find it incredible, frankly, that people are trying to call those states before they've been called on the ground. We know that this is a deeply controversial, very problematic election. We've seen a president of the United States of America allege fraud, preemptively claim victory, say that he's going to the Supreme Court. This is shocking, Francine. We've talked about the elections for several months now. I think at some point you have to call it like it is. This is shocking, and we have to encourage people to wait until we know the official results.
But Leslie, why, I mean, what's most surprising, and we have been told, and you're right, that actually some of the great analysis that we read kind of predicted this very model, but why is this election in 2020 so close?
It's close for many reasons. First of all, the United States is very divided. People have very different views on who they want the president of the United States of America to be. People react very differently to a crisis. Some people are seeing this pandemic through the lens of the economy. They're very worried about their jobs. And for some people, that means being worried about a Vice President, Biden, who might not keep the economy open. And I think that President Trump has been very successful with some people in scaring them into believing that Vice President Biden will shut down the economy and that he will pursue a socialist agenda. There have been a number of messages in the discourse around the elections that I'm sure are influencing people's vote. But ultimately, it's a divided country. We've known for a long time that the national polls indicated a significant gap and advantage for Vice President Biden. But state by state, in the battleground states, it's been close. And even when there's been a margin, sometimes as much as 6 or 7 or 8%, people have been very unwilling to commit to how that would actually turn out the day in the context where people are voting in a pandemic, with misinformation, with all sorts of politics. It's not surprising that we are where we are. The election in 2016 came down to these states. It's coming down to these states again. But two things that are surprising One is that Arizona went to Vice President Biden. Not everybody thought that would happen. And the other one is my home state, Nebraska, for the second time in its history, has split its electoral college vote. This is a very red state. President Trump traveled to Omaha. He held a rally, and they voted for Vice President Biden in NE2.
Right.
So that's a very interesting result.
Leslie, seeing over the wire, and folks, this is a serious headline. In Green Bay, Wisconsin, they're literally waiting to count based off ink for the printer, and there is a legitimate report that the voting clerk has returned with printer ink. I didn't think I would be saying that 12 hours ago. Leslie Vinjamuri, if this is the case and we're seeing these historic moments, it devolves back to the suburbs. I looked at the Philadelphia suburbs today just to see that dynamic. What did you glean from the suburbs of Philadelphia, the suburbs of this nation?
I mean, the suburbs they've been the interesting story. They've been fascinating. There have been women peeling off in the suburbs. They're peeling off their support for President Trump. Many wealthy Americans that are not pleased with the president's agenda. Some very good analysis coming out of people like Amy Walters saying the suburbs might be lost to the Republicans in this round, but the Democrats shouldn't assume that that result will hold if that's what we see when we get through this election and really look carefully at all the data. That's not a long-term shift. That's something that might be specific to this president.
Very good. Leslie Vinjamuri, too short a visit. Thank you so much. And not only thank you on this election eve, but also for your help with us across all of what we've done in the recent months. Leslie Vinjamuri is at Chatham House. I do want to note it is about the big states, about the medium states, think Wisconsin there, but also the littler states. We forget that Nevada is really contested right now with 6 electoral votes. Mr. Biden, I'm seeing, has some form of number of 50.2%, and Mr. Trump at 47.9%, that with almost 80% of the vote in. Maybe we'll get an update on Nevada as well as the other more eastern and Midwest contested states. On the international ramifications on this election 2020, the support of our military for their next president, James Stavridis, in the 6 o'clock hour. Stay with us through the morning as this election evening unfolds. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
what is happening today in India is actually a determination to rebuild our economy.
India has an opportunity not only competing in the space of the factory of the world, but a very big opportunity to compete in being the office of the world.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
With the First Word News, I'm Ritika Gupta. The presidential race is still too close to call, but President Trump is claiming he won. And early today at the White House, he denounced several battleground states that are still counting votes.
We'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list. We will win this.
It's unclear what the president meant. It's routine for states to keep counting votes after Election Day. That's happening in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, and others. Meanwhile, Joe Biden is optimistic.
We believe we're on track to win this election. And we're feeling real good about Wisconsin and Michigan. And by the way, it's going to take time to count the votes. We're going to win Pennsylvania.
Biden made his potential path to the White House a little easier by winning Arizona. That's the first state he has won that President Trump took in 2016. Meanwhile, Democrats' chances of taking control of the Senate are slipping away. Several vulnerable Republican incumbents were able to defeat Democratic challengers. Republicans now hold a 53-47 Senate advantage, and almost everything would have to go right for the Democrats in the undecided seats for them to win a majority. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Ritika, thanks so much. Mixed markets right now. Futures are red and they're green as well. The VIX really 35.15. Two items of note. Out of Milwaukee, the election director saying Wisconsin heading towards a 6 a.m. announcement. We'll see. And in Nevada, it is close, and we now have 85% of the vote in, 49.5% for the vice president, 48%, 11,000 vote difference in Nevada. Biden ahead. Please stay with us. Election 2020. This is Bloomberg.
The big concern is climate change. We can see the global warming accelerating at the moment, and the goals that we must hit are so ambitious. It's 1.5 degrees by 2050, being climate neutral in terms of emissions by 2050. That's a huge challenge. We have to reduce emissions by 50%, 2030, 2040 again. It's very, very ambitious, and mobility plays such a crucial role in there. One thing is to do it in developed countries. I think we're going to get there by 2030, but then the rest of the world, and that's just as important. If you look at developing countries, emerging countries, that's where probably the biggest challenge we are going to face, to also deploy EVs there and make mobility greener in those countries. I know it's possible to move mobility forward fast enough to be able to do its part in this fundamental threat that we're facing.
There are $3 billion being prepared. So the lending program has increased. So that's the very important feature we did not expect.
Surveillance. Good morning, everyone. Election 2020. Tom Keene in New York, Francine Lacroix in London. I'm going to do a data check. I'm going to do 2 data points for you right now. One in the markets and one, of course, of this historic election. Right now, red and green on the screen, just to churn to the markets. NASDAQ 100 does a little bit better. And other than that, it's actually pretty quiet. Yields do come in. And the other is I do want to look at the popular vote now that we have, and that is Mr. Biden, 50%. 50.0, and Mr. Trump, 48.3 is the number we're working with. That's a tighter popular vote delta than what we saw in 2016. Just one of the items. And Francine, we're focused on Nevada, we're focused on Wisconsin, and I'm sure something else will appear in the next 10 minutes.
Yeah, Tom, I'm really focused on Nevada, actually. So, I'm looking at our live blog and looking at the probability on, for example, Betfair Exchange. Now, Biden is now trading at 57% on the Betfair Exchange. Again, we've seen quite a lot of volatility when it comes to betting on who the next president will be. We're still counting votes, so the election outcome is unknown. I need to make that very clear. But, of course, the markets are trying to get up front of it. So they're looking in part by the tweets by specialists and in part by the betting market. And, Tom, I'm focused on Nevada because, of course, we thought that Nevada was going to go to Biden. Walking in tonight, the expectations were that it would be close. Democrats should still hold it, but again, it's all to play right now. So we'll see when we have Nevada. And again, the key for President Trump is that if he gets Nevada, if he wins in Nevada, then there's still a path for him to get reelected. So to discuss all of this and the impact this could have on the markets is Joyce Chang, JP Morgan Chair of Global Research. Joyce, we need to look at almost the minute-by-minute market action to see whether they're choosing one candidate over the other of who will become president. But what would be difficult for the market to swallow? Is it, extra regulation? Is it no stimulus? And under what kind of scenario would we see that?
Well, when we had done surveys of investors, they were actually more concerned about a contested election and volatility around that than the outcome. We've been doing these, very probability-weighted scenarios on the outcomes from our U.S. equity group, from Marko Kolanovic and Dubravko Lakos, and we had a range, 3,900 if it's a Trump victory, 3,600 for year-end, which has been our target for a long time, and 3,300 to 3,400, if it's a blue wave. But when we've asked investors what they're most worried about, when we've asked if it's a contested election, what do you think happens to the S&P 500? We've had 50% say, oh, the S&P 500 could go down 5 to 10%. So I just think, you have to let this whole process play out. It's a record turnout. And some of this is not a surprise. You only started counting the votes for Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania today. And we knew that we wouldn't get results in some states like Pennsylvania until the end of the week. So, I would just stress, that the orderly election and a clear, decisive election had been much of the focus. And that, I think, remains the focus right now. And then, the market will get back to looking at the issues that will really move it over the next 3 to 6 months. What happens with a fiscal stimulus? Where are we with a vaccine? But right now, I think that, there's a range of outcomes, and we are seeing Republicans have clearly outperformed what was polling more recently. But we also see that a lot of the votes have not been counted yet. And a lot of the votes that are coming in from urban areas that are more diverse haven't been counted yet. So I just think that patience is the real key here. And what the market wants to see is something that is orderly.
But Joyce, so no matter who becomes president, and maybe that's, it's something that's mathematical, if we're going to see a contested election, and President Trump actually made that very clear 2-3 hours ago when he gave that speech at the White House, what do markets do? Like, how contested is contested?
Well, I think, first of all, everybody will look at what the rules clearly are, which leads them to the states. Every state has to certify the vote. There's 8,000 different jurisdictions. You have a safe harbor deadline that isn't until December the 8th. So there is a process in place. And a number of elections, have not been decided on election day itself. Now, we've only had 2 instances of elections being contested, in 1878 and then the Gore-Bush election. But it is up to the states to certify the election. So they need a time to count all of the votes that have been cast. And some of this is not new news. We knew that this would take a couple of days for the key states. So I think that what the market will be looking at is, is this going to actually proceed in an orderly way as far as the procedures that are on the books to count the votes and to have the states who have the responsibility for that certify it. So talking about going to the Supreme Court or not counting votes that have already been cast, I mean, these kinds of things are not within the jurisdiction of President Trump to put out there. There are clear rules that are in place, and that's what the market will be looking at. Do you have a process with integrity where there is an orderly process in place that will be reported?
In a very late Tuesday evening and this early Wednesday morning, Joyce Chang with J.P. Morgan with us, and we'll continue with Dr. Chang. I do want to note here that we're getting within the flightiness of the markets. We're seeing red on the screen for SPX now flat and Dow futures a negative 151. Joyce Chang, I think one of the great questions here is, what does it mean for stimulus? We've got 47-47 last I looked in the Senate. We're certainly not seeing the Democratic blue wave in the Senate. And, who knows what the presidential outcome would be. Do you just then assume stimulus gets punted into 2021 and will be a lesser trillion-dollar statistic?
Well, it was going to get punted into 2021 in any event, because the key thing to look at is the budget reconciliation process. I mean, there was never a scenario where you would get to the supermajority of 60. So you were going to have to put this into budget reconciliation to begin with. And it looks like GOP could very well keep the Senate, but with a slightly smaller margin. It had not been easy to even get the $500 billion skinny bill through. So I think a lot of what will play out on the stimulus will depend on what happens with COVID-19. Will there be more of a sense of urgency? If you see a stronger second wave as the winter months hit in, and that puts more pressure on it. But you're really looking at a budget reconciliation process in March or April till this comes. And we've seen, the markets, do so many different, iterations even in the last couple of weeks. I mean, you still have months before you could actually see some of these measures that have been talked about really come into place.
What does gridlock look like for J.P. Morgan? How do you write that 12-page essay?
Well, we've been saying that, gridlock is something where we saw a scenario. The 3,600, our U.S. equity strategy team has kept that very consistently since July. And the gridlock scenario was the probability weighted scenario to get to the 3,600. So you've got, different forces in play. So, if it's gridlock, there's less fears that you're going to have some of the tax cuts rolled back. You have, then it depends on what the presidential result is. I mean, if you have a split Congress with a Biden presidency, what is the ability to get through a really big fiscal stimulus package? So is it $1 trillion or $2 trillion? And that makes a big difference. But I think that we really do also have to see what happens with the vaccine. and what happens with the second wave as well for COVID-19, because that's going to give a sense of urgency. I mean, the vaccine is going to take a while to come. There's, I think, going to be growing sentiment that you have to have some type of fiscal stimulus to tide everything over until that point. So, I think it's early to say exactly how it will play out, but the split scenario of having is one that we had contemplated, where as an outcome.
Joyce Chang with us, and I want to break in here, Joyce and Francine, with news coming from Wisconsin. This is the relative turnout in reporting so far, the relative reporting, rather, of Madison, the University of Wisconsin, Dane County, greater than 98%. Then north to Green Bay, we'll talk to David Harrow later, 66%. And if you come down to Kenosha, on the Illinois border, those results are they have 70% of the estimated voting in, and we're looking for results there to come in rather shortly. Francine?
Joyce, I'm probably going to ask you the most difficult question out there, because it's very difficult to quantify, it's very difficult to put it in your research, but no matter who becomes president, there are a lot of people in the U.S. that will find this U.S. election illegitimate. It will further erode the faith in our democratic institutions. How does that play out from an economic point of view? What are the consequences of this on the U.S. economy, on the U.S. institutions longer term?
Well, I think that, everybody is watching this election, that they will have more questions about the electoral college system if you have a popular vote and electoral outcome that differ. And there will be a discussion about just the whole system that's in play. If it's disputed and contested, that was something that was actually a worse fear than the outcome itself, in many ways. So that will, have an impact. So I think all of these things have been discussed as part of the election. Will it mean something where there's a return to more multilateralism, or we keep, in an approach that is, more, bilateral, transactional, driven by personalities. So that discussion is, I think going to play out. But this is why I do think that just what happens the next few days, what happens at the state level, taking the time to count all of the votes, respecting the integrity of the system, that's the key thing, to watch right now.
Joyce Chang, thank you so much. With J.P. Morgan, the head of their global research department. I really want to point out the narrowness here. We were looking at 9,000 votes in Wisconsin. I've now got a report of 7,000 vote difference, a little more than that, 49.3% for the vice president, 49% for President Trump as well. We've got much more coming up. James Bianco will join us with Bianco Research, and Martin Schenker will stop by, of course, head of all of our content worldwide, and a wonderful, wonderful perspective from Schenker and Bianco. Red and green on the screen. Stay with us. Election 2020. This is Bloomberg.
think you'll have to produce less beer in 2021?
No, I don't think so. I think consumers will find a way. But I mean, if there are restrictions, but consumers, of course, they're smart and they'll learn to live with those restrictions, I think some occasions will migrate.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Rishika Gupta with the Bloomberg First Word News. President Trump is falsely claiming he's been re-elected. Early today at the White House, he also said there's been election fraud and vowed to challenge states that are still counting votes in a race that's too close to call.
We'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list. We will win this.
It may take several days for some states to tally all their votes. Counting is still taking place in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, and others. Meanwhile, Joe Biden is optimistic.
We believe we're on track to win this election. And we're feeling real good about Wisconsin and Michigan. And by the way, it's going to take time to count the votes. We're going to win Pennsylvania.
Both candidates still have a path to victory. Biden made his a little easier by winning Arizona. That's the first state he has won that President Trump took in 2016. And the Democrats had hopes of recapturing the Senate, but those chances have diminished after Republican victories in Iowa and Montana. Republicans now hold a 53-47 Senate advantage, and almost everything would have to go right for the Democrats in the undecided seats for them to win a majority. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Rishika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine Tom.
Ritika, thanks so much. It is an historic evening, and if you're of a certain vintage, you don't go back to 1888. Even Marty Schenker and I don't do that. But we do go back to 1960 in conversations of Chicago and Mayor Daley and conversations of Alabama. The 1960 vote was 112,827 margin. Maybe we won't get that here. But Marty Schenker, if you sum up the states that the vice president needs, you get that kind of math. Is it an equivalency to something as controversial as 1960 Kennedy-Nixon?
It could very well be, Tom. You know, you've been talking about Wisconsin just about an hour ago. It looked to me like Joe Biden could lose Wisconsin, then the absentee ballots come in and it's Biden ahead, and now it's a razor-thin margin. And I tell you, if Joe Biden does not win Wisconsin, it's going to be very difficult for him.
Well, the mathematics is there, and we can do the calculus on that and all, but it really speaks to a ribbon nation, and it speaks to the electoral vote process. When we come out of this, Marty, now the inauguration of whoever it's going to be, and even 2 and 4 years on, is the electoral vote under threat?
You know, every election, and they've been, you know, talking about reforming the electoral vote, the Electoral College, and it never happens. And when you have a razor-thin election like this, no one has a mandate for it. So I would suspect that the Electoral College is here to stay for as long as we have a divided country.
Marty, how does this get contested? I mean, does this get contested and overthrown? Does this get contested with civil unrest, and does it become really ugly because it's so narrow? The margin between the two candidates is so close at this moment.
Yeah, you know, Francina, I know a lot of people are concerned and talk about it. You look outside of Washington, you see storefronts boarded up for 10 blocks around here, even though there's no one on the streets. It does seem to me that I think that when you get to a point where people don't understand the democratic process, that's when you have the chances for unrest. And so what we should do is be patient, count the votes, let the states certify those results, and see where the chips fall.
But, Marty, do we underestimate how President Trump has actually changed U.S. politics in the last 4 years? Will we ever be able to go back to, pre-2016? Now, the very democratic institutions of the United States are being questioned.
Well, that Francine, that's for sure. And I think one of the things that I personally take away from this election is how inaccurate the polling was and how the polling dominated the discourse. And I think that that's a function of Donald Trump and the way he governs. It energizes people who are invisible to the pollsters. And that's, I think, one of the storylines of this election, regardless of who wins.
Marty, Nevada goes from 85% to 86% reporting. 2,648 votes were captured seconds ago, minutes ago, with this amazing technology that we have. And then there's a pregnant sentence at the bottom, comma. And those postmarked by Election Day have until November 10 to arrive. Now, Marty, that's a Pony Express coming into Las Vegas or wherever. Yeah. But it's just amazing, Marty, how November 10 is so far out there if we need to go there.
And it is true that a number of states, Pennsylvania being among them, are going to be counting votes that are postmarked Election Day and don't arrive. And that's actually one of the things that Donald Trump is so angry about. He thinks those votes should not be counted and that they're rife for fraud, even though that has never been shown to be true. So it is, a number of people have mentioned that the American election system is the most complicated in the world. There are 50 different elections all happening in the same day. And if ever we were able to fix that, I think it would be a service to democracy.
Marty Shanker, you're in Washington with our Craig Gordon leading our coverage there. What is the zeitgeist you hear from our team? What is the mood on the floor, the question, the mystery that they're trying to study right now?
Well, it's the question of who is going to be the next president of the United States. I mean, right now, if you had to give an advantage, you'd give it to Joe Biden. But we can all see a scenario where Donald Trump could wind up being the president of the United States for a second term. So it's trying to sift through all this conflicting data to come up with a signpost for our customers to make investment decisions. It's very difficult.
Thank you so much. Of course, our Bloomberg Chief Content Officer, Marty Shanker. And Tom, just to update everyone with the latest in Nevada, and I'm, looking at a veteran political reporter that's out on Twitter. We do need to always talk about our sources, but it's a good indication. We understand that there are tens of thousands of mail ballots still to be counted. For the moment, 337,000 of them have been counted. Now, coming up in the next hour, we speak with David Harrow of Wisconsin. He's Harris Associates Chief Investment Officer for International Equity. That's at 6:30 a.m. in New York, 11:30 a.m. in London, and this is Bloomberg.
Welcome to That's Debatable, an interactive series on today's most pressing issues. The resolution this time: is a U.S.-China space race good for humanity? We'll hear from both sides.
The competition, if you look at the past, led to innovation.
A whole new arms race could start.
And we'll get your perspective, too, with help from the artificial intelligence of IBM Watson. I'm John Donvan. Join us for That's Debatable, presented by Bloomberg and Intelligence Squared, Friday on Bloomberg Television.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom and Francine from London and New York. Tom, we have up-to-date minutes on the markets, and we tried to have up-to-date minutes, of course, on the election result 2020 from the United States. The election outcome is still unknown, but when you look at betting markets, when you look at just what's being talked about out there, there's a slight Biden bias for president because of some of the mail-in votes that we understand were probably overwhelmingly for the Democrats. This is what I'm looking at. Treasuries jumping with the dollar. President Donald Trump winning some key states, threatening to fight an overall loss in the Supreme Court. So I'm looking at this mixed election result. Treasury yields falling. S&P futures now erasing gains. I'm also looking at renminbi and Mexican peso, Tom.
Very good. It is getting to exhaustion in early morning. We have a report from Bloomberg and AP that Nevada will take a rest here. We maybe will not see news in the hour. We may get out even till Thursday. That delta under 8,000 votes. I would note also as well in Michigan, we spent a lot of time in Wisconsin and on Nevada as well. It's absolutely remarkable to see some of the mathematics of the absentee ballots in Michigan. There's many more there than there are in Wisconsin, and certainly in Nevada as well. And those results may come in by, quote, Wednesday night, which is a long ways away on that key state as well. We'll continue to bring you these election results, all the news flow, and yes, the punditry as we see it forward. We do this with red and green on the screen. We will look at the international ramifications of this razor-thin vote in America. James Stavridis will join us next. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Election 2020. It is either a very late Tuesday evening or it is a most early Wednesday morning. We'll let you decide. Our team in Washington coalescing all the different data from around this nation. Francine Lacroix and Tom Keene, thrilled that you're with us here as we try to move into Wednesday, and we do so with states arguing and counting and looking at ballots, and of course the two candidates speaking 2 and 2.5 hours ago. The data, as if it matters, was really quite extraordinary, hugely volatile, and now I've got red and green and a churn on the screen. Francine, we've been having fun doing this, but it's not fun. It's a deadly serious game of count every ballot.
It is. You know what, actually, I feel like it's election by tweet because I've been following more accounts than ever. Now I'm looking at the Nevada elections campaign, and they're saying they're going to sleep. So this tweet just came out a couple of minutes ago saying that's it for election results updates until 9 a.m. on November 5th. Now what they say is that they've counted the early votes so far in person, so the person early votes, the person election day votes, and all mail ballots through November 2nd. So there's a number of ballots that arrived after November 2nd that still need to be counted, but that won't be done today, Tom. So that's really pushing it out for at least another 48 hours.
The news flow from our team is extraordinary. We're looking down here at the Bloomberg terminal to get all the data up right now. In terms of counting of the votes, Michigan's moved with a little bit of an add to 80% counted, and Pennsylvania went from, I believe, 74 to 75%. But these are tiny moves for the exhausted team attempting to count votes. They are not exhausted. They were fired up about 2 hours ago. Let us listen to both candidates.
We will win this, and as far as I'm concerned, we already have won it.
I'm here to tell you tonight, we believe we're on track to win this election.
We won states that we weren't expected to win. Florida, we didn't win it. We won it by a lot.
It's going to take time to count the votes. We're going to win Pennsylvania.
So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop.
We're going to have to be patient until the hard work of tallying votes is finished.
And the two candidates speaking. Ms. Alina Agafopoulou is with us with Bloomberg News and has been on the campaign trail. Ms. Alina, just in the last 2 hours, we see the churn of Nevada, the churn of Wisconsin. What is your observation? What is your reporting?
Hey, everyone. Good morning from D.C. Thank you so much for having me. So as of Wednesday morning, we have Joe Biden with 238 electoral votes, while Trump is at 213 electoral votes, leaving both obviously shy of the 270 they need right now. And, you know, when you look at these numbers, there are still several paths through which each candidate can get to that 270. A big win for Biden, you know, in this race so far has been Arizona, which Trump carried in 2016. But Nevada is the next state that we're looking at for Biden. That is the most important state for him right now, because that would be the state that would allow him to get one pathway to the White House. You know, if Biden holds Nevada and he hangs on to Wisconsin, which right now shows him leading by a very small percentage point, then he would really only need Georgia to get him to 270. And so that's one pathway for Biden. You know, however, if Nevada flips to Trump, that would mean that Biden would need 2 more states in order to get to 270. And right now, Michigan and Pennsylvania are looking like more favorable towards President Trump. However, let's not forget that a lot of the mail-in ballots that people believe are largely Democratic have not been yet accounted for in those 2 states. And so we're just waiting to see what's going to happen with Michigan and Pennsylvania, 2 very crucial states for both candidates.
Ms. Verlaine, it looks like Nevada's going to sleep, right? They've just tweeted that that's it for the election update results until November 5th, 9 a.m. So do we just all go to sleep now? If you don't have Nevada, if, you know, there are a couple like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, that may also take some time. Is that it for the next couple of hours?
What we're waiting for right now is really just for Wisconsin. The election officials in the state came out just a few minutes ago, if not just an hour ago, and said that they should have a result for the election within the next couple of hours. And so we're looking at that. But yeah, I mean, we're seeing these election officials really just take their time in order to figure out what's going on. And that's okay. I mean, we're talking about a race that's going to be decided by razor-thin margins. And so, you know, if officials are taking their time. I mean, that's the only way that and we expected this, right? And so we're seeing Nevada sort of take their time, and we're also seeing Pennsylvania and Michigan really not coming through with end results for the next hours, if not couple of days.
Missy, thank you so much. Missy Agafalopoulou with us with Bloomberg News. This is a joy. If you can believe it or not, we've never been in the same room. Joining us now, Jeannie Zayanova, Iona College, her anticipated book coming out, Brutal. Wonderful to have you here, pre-pandemic, to have you in the room is great. I've just got to ask you, within this historic moment, forget about the state-by-state counting. What do you expect from these two candidates on Wednesday?
Well, you know, I would expect that they would say the same thing that you've been saying and that we've all been saying, which is that we need to be patient and count every vote. That's what I would expect and hope. But given the president's comments last night, I think there's some concern that may not be what we hear.
What I heard, and this, I'm going to go to your wonderful previous books and what we're going to hear from Brutal, which is, in the old days, like 1888 and 1960, the president let other people do the yelling and screaming. This is a president who seems to almost enjoy, we're going to the Supreme Court, we're going to be part of the battle. It is original for America, isn't it?
It is. I mean, we don't usually hear, first of all, you know, it's the pandemic, so he stayed in the White House. He was going to try to go to the hotel last night, couldn't because of the pandemic, stayed in the White House, and then, of course, came out last night after Joe Biden. So it's not something we see commonly. And, you know, we have to give the president credit in terms of what he did in places like Florida, over 200,000 more votes than he got in 2016, which is like 250,000 more than Romney got.
Why did he do that? Why did he do that?
You know, he, as we know, announced the day after his inauguration, and I don't think his team or he get enough credit for how they've been able to pull votes. Cuban Americans, others, they have been really, really focused. He deserves credit for that. But what I hope the president does, he can absolutely litigate this out, but count the votes, then let his lawyers take it to court if that's what they want to do. But we've got to let these votes be counted. An unprecedented early vote, over 100 million, plus the millions that went out yesterday. These election officials have been working all night. There's still absentee mail votes to be counted. We knew this was going to take time. And we have to remember, it always takes time to certify these votes, so it's not unusual. But what is unusual is what you were just talking about, this razor-thin margin in these states. It was like that in the 3 states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, in 2016. We expect it again, and we know now it's going to be like that again this year. And it's just something we have to get used to in this country. And for my pollster friends and the prognosticators who I love, the idea of a blowout or a blue wave simply didn't come to fruition. We're going to have to talk about that in the weeks and months that follow.
But, Jean, just to be clear, what can the president actually stop? This is voting that is coming in now, or this is voting that was done after the cutoff on, you know, the 3rd of November at midnight?
The president technically can't stop anything. He should not be able to stop anything. The states that are allowed to keep, they're all allowed to keep counting. The question of as long as they're allowed to keep receiving ballots is something that is decided by state law or that the courts have made decisions about. So the president simply has to do something that, you know, in his defense and in Joe Biden's defense would be hard for anybody who is fighting this kind of battle, which is you have to sit back and let this take its course. It's going to be probably Friday before we hear about Pennsylvania. We're hearing we may hear Michigan, Wisconsin somewhat earlier, but the president is going to have to be patient, let the state officials do their business. Then if and when there is a litigation to be had, let the lawyers step in and handle that. But the president himself should have nothing to do with this. We live in a federal system. The states have control over counting these ballots, and we need to let the officials do that at this point.
But, Jeannie, is there a concern that actually no matter who wins, people just don't trust the system anymore? Are we talking about half of the United States, you know, half of American citizens not believing the election result because the president called it illegitimate?
You know, I think that's a fear, and it's you know, a real fear. I have to say, I was really heartened last night. As we all know, when we went into yesterday, there was some concern about rioting and violence and those kinds of things. Thankfully, we haven't heard about any of that at this point. We've had record numbers of people over the last several weeks voting. So those are positive signs. Now, we hope that that continues. To your point, there's always a concern that when this is decided, the people and the voters who supported the candidate that's on the losing end are not going to believe what happened. We hope that isn't the case. If we have any precedent to this, it's 2000, and Americans were remarkably willing to listen to the Supreme Court, even in a 5-4 decision that seems partisan to some people. People listened and we moved forward. We hope that happens again because our system depends on the fact that we believe the outcomes of these elections and that we have a peaceful transfer of power, whether it is to the opposite party if Joe Biden wins or the president maintains an office for another term.
Professor, an hour and 10 minutes ago, Francine Lacroix and I were making jokes about running out of ink in printers, as occurred this morning in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Is this any way to run a nation? Are we going to see, I mean, remember the Chads in 2000, and I believe Florida somewhat revolutionized their voting system. Why can't we went to the moon? Why can't we do this right?
I couldn't agree with you more. There's a great book called "Is This Any Way to Run a Democratic Election?" in which one of my colleagues asked the very same question. And this goes back, you know, we're also focused on 2020, 2016. Sure. This goes back many, many years in this country. You just reminded me of the pregnant Chads and all of those things, that lingo we got used to in 2000. It is not a way to run a democratic election. We have to rethink this system. I think we have to think seriously about things like the Electoral College and whether you elect a president when one person gets 3 or more million votes than the person who wins. But again, those are all things we have to think about and we have to reflect on. And, you know, those are constitutional issues. We could do a much better job in terms of our voting technology, training of poll workers, as you mentioned, printers and other things. But we live in a federal system. This is 50 separate elections. It's a big endeavor. We could do it better, to your point. But I think this morning as we wake up, we all have to take a breath and say, thankfully, we've got some great people on the ground in these states.
And Professor Lucas from the control room says, can't we have a national day off when we have the election? That's what Lucas is looking for.
I agree, Lucas.
Professor Lucas is dead on. Professor, thank you so much. Jeannie Zano with us with Iona College with just terrific perspective and very sharp books arguing about our diplomatic system. There are 7 states that can't get the counting into 100%. North Carolina almost there, behind. Tell the cow, Pennsylvania. Maybe we'll hear from them on Friday. Coming up, Stavridis, election 2020. This is Bloomberg Futures. There's red and green on the screen.
Women leaders were actually better at controlling the deaths from COVID-19. Do you think out of this pandemic, we'll see more countries be willing to elect female leaders?
When we look at women leaders, we tend to project on them baggage that they shouldn't bear.
Women are given an opportunity when no one else wants to do the job.
Women had a very clear objective. They wanted to save lives.
The women leaders, if you look at their careers, have also built up a level of trust.
In fact, women have to be better at communication in order to be elected as leaders, whereas this doesn't hold true for men.
We need to get those sexist stereotypes out of our head and give women a fair run for leadership.
Trying to change the stereotypes about women is not only the business of women, but men have to be part of it.
explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
Their CPG history, their experience, and really how we might be able to combine together to really create this fantastic public company. And so we kind of got into the SPAC thing a little bit before it became such a hot method of going public.
Good morning, everyone. Election 2020, Bloomberg surveillance across all the morning, and it is a show about the election, the international ramifications. Francine Lacroix and Tom Keene, thrilled that you're with us. Francine, what's your observation right now? We're sort of mid-course in the early morning here in America. What's your observation?
Well, my observation, Tom, is that it's very, very close, but actually it was a stop and start, right? It seems that every hour we think we could get an election or an election result for a state that has not that much, a big amount of number of electoral college votes, but actually could be quite significant because it's so narrow. So it's amazing at how undecided, for example, the markets are. So we've seen quite a lot of volatility. It's just too soon to call, Tom. And what surprised me is that, there's a clear understanding, but I don't know whether it's being priced in the markets, that a lot of the mail-in votes were presumably more towards the Democrats. That's what we found out in the last 10 hours, but I don't know whether that's really filtered through some of the betting markets.
No, I'm not sure it's in the betting markets, yes, but we're certainly seeing that tilt within any of the reporting on the mail-in ballots. And there's been almost an exhaustion, folks, in the last 45 minutes. We're getting in a little less data right now. Maybe that will change in the coming minutes. With futures up 15. Right now, James Trevitas joins us. He, of course, has been a wonderful friend of Bloomberg surveillance. He is a former Supreme Allied Commander for NATO. But what he's really done is contribute a body of work. I can't say enough about Sailing True North. The joy of this book on, I believe it's 10 admirals, is you can pick out your 3 or 4 favorite to read immediately and save the rest for later. Admiral, thank you so much for joining us. I've got a delicate military question in a moment, but I want to go to your book where you speak of resilience in the modern election. You were vetted as a vice presidential candidate for Secretary Clinton. Is this any way to run a nation? Is this any way to run an election?
Well, let me start by saying, by the way, I'm a registered independent, and subsequent to the last election 4 years ago, I was invited to Trump Tower, spoke with President Trump about the possibility of a cabinet position in his administration. So I'm a centrist. Let's stay on democracy as a function. And here I'll quote Churchill, Tom. Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. And we ought to kind of step back and in all its messiness and chewiness and frustrations, we ought to recognize that we are privileged to live in a democracy where we get to cast votes. And I have just 3 simple things to say, which I hope a lot of people are saying this morning. Number 1 is take a deep breath. Let's not let this accelerate into confrontation in our society. Number 2, we're going to have to be patient. And I think we will get a result within 48 to 72 hours. We can wait that long. And then thirdly, as your previous guest said, every vote counts. Every vote is sacred if it was postmarked or made before Election Day. It deserves to be counted, even if that's after Election Day. With that prescription, we'll get through this.
Admiral, in the last, I'm going to say 24 hours, and this is Jonathan Swan over Axios, speaking of our most senior military, briefing news organizations about the military's placement if there was protests in the street. I found that highly unusual. Did you?
I did. It's beyond unusual. It is unprecedented, as far as I know. And I think I have been a senior officer, was in the military for 37 years, never heard of anything remotely like that. I think it's an unfortunate indicator of how General Mark Milley, our chairman, who's a terrific individual, Princeton graduate, by the way, a very smart man. He's trying to control any strange expectations out there because this is not the job of troops. This is a job of election officials and law enforcement officials if necessary. And thank God, so far, we've seen nothing that would require that.
Admiral, you know, no matter who wins, how many people in the U.S. will think that this election is not legitimate? And actually, what's the long-term consequence of that for one of the biggest democracies on earth?
Yeah, you're putting your finger on the right issue, in my view. And let's take it from an international perspective. People are doing high fives this morning in Moscow, in Beijing, in Tehran, in Pyongyang, in Caracas, because they see us, in their view, caught up in this crunch of democracy. They are underestimating the strength of the American public and the American people, in my view. We will see some who will look at this election and deride it, but personally, I'm confident that our institutions will hold here. We will have a legitimate result, and we need to, at some point, when we get through this, present a very united front to the rest of the world, because we would not want someone to miscalculate, that think this was a moment of American weakness. I do not think so.
Admiral, will the Supreme Court get involved? And if they get involved, given the composition of the court, will they rule in favor of President Trump?
In my view, it is still indeterminate whether this will rise to the level of a Supreme Court action. We've already heard President Trump use those words. We certainly have precedent for this in 2000, as we were discussing a moment ago on the show. If they get involved, what I hope as an American citizen is that each judge will rule without fear or favor and will follow the law wherever it leads.
Admiral, we've all got to read up on this. We've got to read up on our democratic processes, and part of that is the relationship of the military to the cacophony, which is our democracy and our political system. How's the military doing it? Not only the people comfortable at the Pentagon, but the people at risk abroad. How do they perceive this political tumult?
Thanks for asking that question, and we ought to just hit pause for a second in all of our frustration and say to ourselves, there are young men and women, volunteers all, who are walking the dusty streets of Kabul, who are flying jets at risk over the Bering Straits, who are in destroyers steaming through the South China Sea. I'll tell you what they think. They think about the mission in front of them. They are focused on defending the nation. What is happening in the background to them doesn't matter on a day-to-day basis. We ought to be very proud of that and very thankful for that. And as I said earlier, our opponents should not miscalculate on that score.
Edmund, one final question, and we've got to get back to the mundane of this election. The budgets here of stimulus and of a national pandemic, how are our budgets right now of our military? There's a great worry of understaffed aircraft carriers and on and on. Is there an improvement in the budget into the next term of whomever is president?
I think our defense budget is adequate to defend the nation. I think we ought to be trying to shift resources within that budget, Tom, to things you and I have talked about: space, unmanned vehicles, cybersecurity, special forces. I think those 21st century capabilities need more resources. We're going to have to find those, in my view, inside the defense budget. So look for defense budgets, frankly, whether it's President Trump 2 or President Biden 1, look for defense budgets to be flat, but to shift toward those 21st century capabilities. That would be the smart money.
Admiral, thank you so much for joining us. James Stavridis, I can't say enough, folks, about his literary efforts. The Leader's Bookshelf is something I throw at children at a high and often rate. Of course, a Bloomberg opinion columnist and Supreme Commander with NATO. Francine, to me, the chart has gone, the map of the country, rather, has gone fairly quiet here in the last half hour, which, as you mentioned, indicates exhaustion. Maybe in Nevada. I would note a little tweak of turnout increase in Michigan. We're getting a little bit there.
Yeah, Tom, so I'm looking, at my Bloomberg terminal constantly just to make sure that I'm not missing anything, that I have all the correct updates. But it does seem, look, it's almost 6 a.m. certainly in the East Coast of the U.S. And so there are a lot of places where it's 4 a.m., 5 a.m. that are closing up. So Nevada, really, we understand that Biden's lead, before they decided to stop counting, the lead was narrowing. It's a very close race. Nevada is just one of a handful of swing states that could change the fortunes of Joe Biden and Donald Trump. But for the moment, Tom, you're right. It is much more quiet than in the last hour, simply because I think a lot of places have shut for the night and, will resume counting a little bit later on.
I'm doing eyeball math out to 4 digits, which means you flunk, and you particularly do that at 6:24 a.m. 7,000, 8,000 votes in Nevada, the same 7,000 votes in Wisconsin as well. And in Michigan, it is a lofty 200,000, but there's some whispers there of Detroit and maybe the vice president narrowing that gap. On the data front, red and green on the screen, there have been moments over the last 2 hours, maybe 3 hours, where we've had massive green on the screen, all based off the rumors of what we're going to see of these deeply divided states. But right now, we've calmed down to red and green on the screen, with futures up 10, the VIX in a stick 34.52 as well. In the yield space, 0.79% on the 10-year yield. And Francine, I'd mentioned oil with a little bit of a lift.
Yeah, I like that you're looking at oil, Tom. If you look at some of the changes that we could see, depending on who's president, remember, it's all about the Senate, but I would look at regulation of tech company, regulation in general. I would talk about taxes, and then I would also talk about energy policy for the United States. Treasuries are jumping, sending the 10-year yield to the biggest drop since April. The dollar strengthening amid all of this uncertainty over who will be the next American president. Coming up next, David Harrow, Harris Associates Chief Investment Officer for International Equity. This is Bloomberg.
The Census Bureau has asked Congress for a 120 extension. I don't know that you even have to ask, and I think 120 days isn't nearly enough.
market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
Good morning, everyone. Election 2020. Thrilled you're with us. Bloomberg Surveillance. Francine Lacroix and Tom Keene. And it is, as we expected, tense across America as the count begins after this historic election. Right now, we need an update with our First Word News in New York. It's Ritika Gupta.
Tense it is, Tom. The presidential race is just too close to call, but President Trump is claiming he won. And early today at the White House, he denounced several battleground states that are still counting votes.
We'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list. We will win this.
It's unclear what the president meant. It's routine for states to keep counting votes after Election Day. That's happening in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, and others. Meanwhile, Joe Biden is optimistic.
We believe we're on track to win this election. And we're feeling real good about Wisconsin and Michigan. And by the way, it's going to take time to count the votes. We're going to win Pennsylvania.
Biden made his potential path to the White House a little easier by winning Arizona. That's the first state he has won that President Trump took in 2016. Meanwhile, Democrats' chances of taking control of the Senate are slipping away. Several vulnerable Republican incumbents were able to defeat Democratic challengers. Republicans now hold a 53-47 Senate advantage, and almost everything would have to go right for the Democrats in the undecided seats for them to win a majority. A big victory in California for gig economy giants such as Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash. Voters approved a hotly contested ballot measure that will exempt them from a state law requiring most of their workers to be classified as employees. It's estimated that will save Uber and Lyft alone more than $100 million on employment benefits and protections for drivers. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Tom?
Ritika Gupta, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate that this morning. We usually would talk with our guest right now, David Harrow, about international investment, but we rip up the script. If you're in a hurry, out of Milwaukee, it's I-43 up to Green Bay. But if you're smarter, like David Harrow, you go through Fond du Lac up 41. You curve across the landscape of Wisconsin. He is encyclopedic on Wisconsin. David Harrow has run for Republican office or thought about it, at least in Wisconsin. And we're thrilled that he could join us this morning on his Wisconsin. David, I'm sure you're not surprised at the closeness of the vote in Wisconsin, but what is the nuance and character that you observe of it right now?
Well, it's a very bifurcated state, as you know. It's literally Dane County, which is Madison, where the state of the seat is and where the university is, and it's Milwaukee combined versus the rest of the state. And, you know, those are two big population centers, but they're two very, very big blue zones. And this is what, when you saw Wisconsin kind of flip, Wisconsin was ahead for Trump in the beginning, and then when those votes got counted in Milwaukee, it flipped, and it's literally a very bifurcated state.
I know that they're focused on Packers 49ers tomorrow night, but the fact is the world is now focused on Green Bay. Is Green Bay, is that the in-between that can be that dynamic of the 7,000 vote difference right now?
Yeah, because there are parts of Green Bay which are Republican and there are parts that are Democrat. So it really is a wild card. And the northern part of Wisconsin tends to be very, very Republican. And it's kind of maintained that for the most part. So we'll see how these uncounted Green Bay votes, how they actually lay out.
Fran, I want to interrupt on Michigan. We have votes in from, I believe, Lansing, the capital of Michigan, and, of course, the unrest that we've seen there around the governor over the recent weeks. I'm doing an eyeball here off of the Bloomberg terminal and from our good sources, and I think, Francine, on a 200,000 vote difference, Mr. Biden has picked up a lot off of Lansing. That's as scientific as I get. That wouldn't get me a job at Oakmar Capital, Francine, but I think a lot gets it done. The vice president really picks it up where it's 49.8% versus 48.5%, with 83% of the votes estimated to be in.
Yeah, so Tom, we're looking at AP, we're looking at, of course, the results coming in, and then we're playing a bit of game theory, which, you know, is always dangerous, but always important, because certainly that's probably what the markets are doing. And if you look at some of the gaming, if you look at some of the columns, you know, Biden versus Trump, there are two accounts that I'm looking at on Twitter, Nate Silver and Nate Cohn of the New York Times. And, you know, looking at the news out of Nevada, they, I think both are trying to game it, giving it to Biden. On Michigan, they have less concrete data on what exactly will happen, but Tom's update also points it into that direction. David Harrow, when you look at, you know, where we are, which is 6 a.m. New York time, can we game it out, or is it just, it's so razor thin that we need to wait, not even tomorrow, but for the coming days and weeks?
Well, it's pretty razor thin because you have the Michigan-Pennsylvania situation, and even still you have, you know,